Hi there, folks. Getting ready to go live. It's currently 2:02. We'll start the live discussion, all that, at 2:10 at normal class start time. For now, if you've got comments, questions, you can put over in the chat box, and we'll deal with them as they come up. Also, when you do come in, please tag yourself so I know who is here. All right. All right, 6 minutes till we go live. Okay, we're going live in 4 minutes. Remember, when you do come in, tag yourself over in the comment section. If you need to register an account or something in order to do that, you can also send me an email. I'll be checking my email periodically during the class to see if there's anyone who needs to register. So if you haven't registered yet, you just need to register your YouTube account. I guess I just assume all of you guys already have YouTube accounts. If you don't and you do need to register it before you can do it, great. You can just send me an email saying you're part of the live stream, and then register while we're talking. Okay. Hi there, Ian. We'll get started with everything in about 3 minutes. This will be the third one of these classes I've live streamed the past couple days. It's just I'm filling up the time this week. And what's interesting about it is that I notice people start watching this, like randos that are not part of the class, just want to tune into my classes, which is a little frightening. But so yeah, I had a lecture yesterday in research methods of all classes, and hi there, Neil, about 30 people were part of the class, and that's fine. And that video's got way more people viewing it, and I do not quite understand why, but joys of YouTube, right? I see 5 of us are watching at this point, and again, we've got 2-3 minutes. No question of the day today, however, because logistically, I have not figured out how I would do that. So your participation points will come just from what you put over in the chat window. Another thing I learned by doing this a couple times is that all the writing I put up gets mirror image reversed, which makes perfect sense. I don't know why I never thought of it before. So I actually specially prepared stuff for this class, right? So see if my handwriting looks even worse than usual. That is entirely because I wrote all of this backwards. That's how much I love all of you. Hi there, Peter. I am feeling very well. Thanks for asking in. I just had an appointment with a cardiologist today, and I got cleared for gradual return to normal activity. I'm tired a lot, but aside from that, I'm feeling pretty good. A lot of people in the class sent me very positive thoughts, and I appreciate all of that. Okay, again, 2 minutes, and we will get started. Hi there, Zane. So you guys also get to see what my office looks like at home. It's where I actually tape a lot of TV stuff. So try and angle it so you can see like this. It looks like my bookcase is here. I normally angle a little. Oh, Amy says, when's our finals going to be like the midterm? Yes, it's going to be exactly like the midterm. So, so Ian, you're telling me that the writing is not actually reversed for you. So you guys, so this poster, tell me, is that reversed for you? Because that's reversed for me. Is that reversed for you or no? That is hilarious. Oh boy. My methods class got a lot more interesting right now because I just realized I thought everything was reversed, and in fact, it was not. Okay, that's just me then. So this is, that's gonna be a lot. This is gonna be entertaining just for me then, and I'm okay with that. Hi there. All right, so oh boy, well I'll rewrite that later. All right, so it is 2:11. Hi there, everybody, and so. Let's get started. So the way this is going to work is we're not going to be able to be as interactive as normal because I can't hear you. You can talk at your computers, but I can't hear you when you do. So any comments you want to make, I need you to put it right over in the chat. I'm sorry, for you, it's probably over there in the chat box, and I'll respond to those questions as we go. Now, we are going to have to start off by figuring out what our first topic is going to be. So I know this is all reversed for you, but it looks fine for me, and I'm really the one who's important here, right? So I've got the Moynihan Report, I've got education policy, I've got Robert Mueller, I've got wildfires, I've got Facebook, I've got Michael Bloomberg, and I've got sex and birth. Take a quick poll over in the chat window. You tell me which of the topics you want. Again, Moynihan Report, education policy, wildfires, Facebook, Michael Bloomberg, sex and birth rates, or Robert Mueller. Up to you. Again, as long as you don't pick Robert Mueller, because shut up, Ian. Thank you, Amy. George, what are you people doing? Stop it with the Mueller. All right, so I've got votes for education policy, for Mueller, because you all hate me, because Bloomberg, thank you. Bloomberg actually I think probably works pretty well because Bloomberg ties into our reading about education policy today. Hi, this is Serena. All right, I'll give it a minute for anyone who wants to leave a comment and say what you guys want to talk about, and we'll start with that. Cannot believe I went all this trouble of getting this thing ready, and it's backwards for you. Oh boy. Oh. I will rewrite it a little later. Okay, about 30 more seconds for comments. This is the day you guys are going to troll me. You're all going to say Mueller. Oh boy. All right, what if I promise we'll do Mueller second? All right, can we do Mueller second? It did say Facebook has an option. Yes. Yes, it did, Anna. You can change back to, you can change. Oh, this is why I hate the internet. Okay. And let's see. I missed here. Mueller, report, policy, multipliers, Facebook, Bloomberg. That was option, Serena. Second. All right, this is entirely first for me, but I think for you guys, you'll be able to read this one now. So there is your list of options. I've got Bloomberg, Mueller, education policy, wildfires, monitoring report, and sex and birth rates. All right, so all right, let's do Bloomberg a little bit, and then we'll move over to talk about Robert Mueller. So real quick, who can tell me what exactly Michael Bloomberg did that leads to him being in the news this week, aside from running for president? Because we know he's running for president. He has no chance on God's green earth, but he's going to try to run for president again. So what did Michael Bloomberg do that came up in the podcast? Let's see who can get some participation points by telling me what Bloomberg did. So Michael Bloomberg, for those of you who don't know, we're waiting for the response to that, was the former 3-term mayor of New York, which is exceptional because prior to Michael Bloomberg, he was only allowed to be mayor of New York for 2 terms. He actually successfully changed the law so he could run for 3 terms. He's seen as a technocratic leader, meaning he's not especially partisan. He doesn't really do Democratic, Republican things so much as he just gets transit working and fixes the potholes. So it's what's called a technocratic leader. He's worried about making things run properly. Hi there, Vaughn. So Dan has got it right. Bloomberg made a massive university donation. He gave $1.8 billion, this billion with B, to Johns Hopkins University. This is also just a weird name for university because it's Johns Hopkins. Like it's not possessive. I know it's 2 people's last names. One's last name is Johns. One's last name is Hopkins. So you have $1.8 billion to Johns Hopkins University for financial aid. The idea is that because of his gift, essentially there will be need-blind admissions for Johns Hopkins for the foreseeable future, meaning that Johns Hopkins, when you apply there, will not worry about how much money you have when they decide whether or not they're going to admit you. Now, why is this? So now this is obviously a good thing. We in general want universities to not pay too much attention to how much money you have on the side to admit you or not. Your admission to university should be based on, at least we probably think, merit rather than how much money you have. Although we should note most universities do, in fact, base some extent of your admissions on how much money they think you have. Now, can you tell me why universities would care how much money you have before they decide to admit you? Why are they more likely to admit people with lots of money or people with not very much money? And why would they take account of that? Why should it matter? So put a response over there when you get the chance. So Bloomberg gives all this money, and this actually, there you go, Serena. See how much you can afford. Right, so the university, they want to receive payment. They're more likely to donate after, rich people are more likely to donate after graduation. Neil's saying because they want to know if you'll be able to repay student loans or not. In fact, the university does not really care if you can repay the student loans or not because the university isn't the one who gives you the student loans. That's the federal government or a bank. So the university doesn't actually care very much whether you can repay your student loans. It matters a little bit for some accreditation purposes. If too many students can't repay the student loans, it makes the university look bad. But the big reason they pay attention to it is that university pricing is highly variable. So the sticker price university is kind of like sticker price for a car. No one actually ever pays the sticker price. The question is how much you're going to get a discount of when you get to the university. So if if you can't afford a lot of money, the university is going to have to give you more money to get you to come there. Now, if you're a very highly sought after student, you're top of your class and everything, they might be willing to do that. But if you're not one of the top students, then they're not going to be interested in giving you that much money. They want to make more money. They make money off of admissions, and so they want to bring in more. If two students are equally situated, but one has more money than the other, then the university was going to want to bring in the student who can afford to pay more for tuition. So all universities, basically universities, pay attention to how much money you can bring in. There are a few, mostly incredibly wealthy universities, I'm thinking of Princeton here, that doesn't care how much money you have because they've got more money than Croesus, so they don't really care. But most universities, including the university you guys are attending right now, care very much how much money you have and are going to be more likely to admit you if you have more money. Now, that can be good, bad, or indifferent because, of course, that's how capitalism works. But there's an interesting question. So Bloomberg is part of this group of mega billionaires. And Bloomberg, of course, no one can argue he didn't do a lot to deserve his money. Of course, he started the Bloomberg Corporation, Bloomberg News. Bloomberg terminals are basically news machines that Wall Street firms and anyone involved in the financial industry buys and gets access to, and it gives them access to all sorts of information about the market and to news. And so Bloomberg built that corporation from the ground up. Certainly, he can do whatever he wants with his money. But we've seen a spate of people like Bloomberg. I'm also thinking of Mark Zuckerberg, the founder of Facebook, who are giving billions and billions of dollars away. And this leads to an interesting question, whether this is actually a good thing or not. Now, it's certainly a good thing for philanthropists to be giving money away rather than philanthropists not giving money away and just using it to buy, bigger yachts. You can now buy a yacht that has its own yacht built into it. And, rather than putting yachts on top of other yachts, I think it's probably better to give money to charity. However, as a society, I think you can certainly make an argument that we are better off in a society if our society actually just taxed people rather than have to rely on them giving this sort of money back. I mean, if you have $1.8 billion, you give it to Johns Hopkins, which is already a very selective university. So, I mean, the people going to Johns Hopkins, the people going to Johns Hopkins are already very privileged people. They're already whiter than the rest of the population. They're already richer than the rest of the population. And so as a result, you're going to make those people a little better off. If you gave that $1.8 billion to, the State University of New York system, the SUNY system, or the CUNY system, you could help a lot more people. And it would make a much bigger difference in the lives of more people. So no one's saying you shouldn't be able to give the money where he wants. But as a society, I'm not sure we should be applauding billionaires who just give a lot of money away, simply because as a society, we have a right, we as a society, it's maybe in our best interest of society for that money to be put to better use in different places. So if we, instead of Bloomberg's paying $1.8 billion to Johns Hopkins, if we were able to spend that money on something else, society might be better off if the money was spent somewhere else, doing something else to make college more affordable for a broad swath of people. And you could make essentially all of the SUNYs tuition free, or tuition free for anyone who makes less than $50,000 or $100,000 a year. You could do that. And that would do a lot more to help out education, access to education, than what Bloomberg is doing. So there's two ways to look at this. One is, wow, it's great that we've got billionaires who are willing to give away so much money. The other way to look at this, say, boy, if billionaires can afford to give away this much money, maybe we as a society are doing something wrong. Maybe we're not taxing them enough. And if our infrastructure, things like schools, need that much money, maybe we should be taxing everybody a little bit more to try, and so we don't have to rely on individual philanthropists giving billions of dollars out of their own money. All right, so I know everyone did want to talk about Robert Mueller and what's going on in the Mueller investigation. So why don't you give me any specific questions you have what's going on in the Mueller investigation? I'll give a general background, and we'll get to your specific questions as we go. All right, so the reason we're talking about Robert Mueller is that it had been thought that Mueller had some big revelations that he was saving until after the midterm elections. It is Justice Department guidelines that you're not supposed to release any information about a political candidate in the immediate run-up to an election. Now, of course, we saw in the 2016 election exactly what happens when they don't do that. So 9 days before the election, the head of the FBI James Comey put out a report saying that Hillary Clinton's emails were under investigation. He violated FBI guidelines. He says he did it because essentially he was pretty sure Hillary Clinton was going to win, and he'd be in trouble with the Republican Congress if he didn't put that out. So Mueller didn't do anything, because we thought, okay, he was probably waiting until after the election. That's increasingly looking like it was not the case, because it is a couple weeks after the election now. and we didn't actually get anything out of Robert Mueller. It looks like instead what Mueller was waiting for was for President Trump to put in his disclosures. So President Trump has refused several times to sit for an interview. He is with Robert Mueller. He said in the past he would have been willing to sit for an interview if his lawyers let him, but now he says he will not sit for an interview. And so Mueller gave him a whole bunch of questions that he could write out his answers to. That's important because when the president answers the questions, he will be under oath. The president has not previously answered questions under oath about the topics related to Russia and about collusion. So after the president put in, that's last week, the president put in all of his answers in writing, now we start to be seeing a bunch of stuff coming out of the Mueller investigation. And it looks like it is a lot of things that the president lied about or may have had knowledge of. So there's a couple issues going on here. The first has to do with president's president's business dealings with Russia during the campaign. So during the campaign, the president and his top advisors all said President Trump did not have any dealings, any financial dealings or business dealings with Russia. And it turns out, of course, that he did. And so at this point, we have people who are going to jail for lying to Congress about the fact that the president had business dealings with Russia. We also have this link that we've thought might have existed for a while between President Trump's campaign and WikiLeaks. So this takes a little bit to unravel, but here's essentially the way it works. So WikiLeaks is this crypto-anarchist group led by a Australian/Austrian named Julian Assange. And Assange is, he's a weirdo, but he believes that governments are hiding secrets, and his job is to protect the public by releasing whatever secrets the governments are keeping. And in the past, he was considered to be an ally of liberals in the United States because a lot of his big early splash was actually with video from the Iraq War, where he showed American helicopter pilots firing on Iraqi civilians knowingly. And so he was kind of anti-war, but he was mostly anti-secret and so anti-secrecy. And so during the Bush administration, he was considered to be anti-U.S. government. Now, the Obama administration didn't actually do a whole lot, and that's largely because for the past several years, he's been stuck in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. Why stuck in the Ecuadorian embassy in London? Well, a couple of reasons. The big one is that he was accused of sexual misconduct in cases in Scandinavia. Essentially, Scandinavian sex laws are a little weird, but essentially he, under false pretenses, did not use contraception after telling the women he was going to use contraception. And in some countries, that is considered to be essentially tantamount to rape. So he went into the Ecuadorian embassy so that he could not actually be extradited back to Sweden. And he's also worried that if he's extradited to Sweden or he comes out of his den in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, that he could be extradited to the United States to face charges of computer hacking and things like that, relating to a whole bunch of other matters where he hacked into government systems. Julian Assange, we believe, so the closest we have to the story now is that Julian Assange worked with the Russian government. The Russian government wanted to influence the election in the United States. However, they didn't want their fingerprints on it. So the Russian government, Diana's asking why Ecuador. I couldn't tell you. They're relatively neutral and they were relatively friendly. They were willing to put up with him. Actually, they're getting ready to kick him out right now. They don't like him very much because he's not cleaning up after his cat and he's kind of being a slob. He's been indoors for 5, 6, 7 years now. So he's not cleaning up after his cat. So they want to kick him out. Anyway. So the Russian government hacked into Hillary Clinton's, the Hillary Clinton campaign emails, as well as some personal email accounts for some of Hillary Clinton's advisors. Then they wanted to release those emails. The problem is they didn't want to release them themselves because it would look like it was coming from the Russian government because it was coming from the Russian government. So instead, what they decided to do was to send those emails over to WikiLeaks. And WikiLeaks would put them out, and people tend to trust WikiLeaks, and WikiLeaks never reveals the sources. So WikiLeaks will be able to release these emails. Now, why would WikiLeaks be willing to do this? Well, again, they're anti-secrecy, but also very, very anti-Hillary Clinton. They're like Hillary Clinton because it's Hillary Clinton as being a hawk. As Hillary Clinton is one of the architects of American foreign policy. She was Secretary of State for a long time after all. And so they're anti-Hillary Clinton. They didn't want her elected. So WikiLeaks then tried, apparently, to coordinate with the Trump campaign about when to release all of these emails that they had received from the Russian government. And that's where the story gets a little tricky, because conspiring with a foreigner, that'd be Julian Assange, or indirectly with the Russian government to influence an election is illegal. That would be collusion. Now, of course, as President's lawyers put out, collusion is not a crime, but conspiring to defraud the American government, conspiring to help a foreign government influence American election is in fact a crime. So we know that Julian Assange reached out to some people who were close to Trump. The two people we believe he reached out to first are a guy named Jerome Corsi. Jerome Corsi is a right-wing operative who's worked with another man named Roger Stone. Roger Stone is a longtime conservative operative. He's known as a dirty tricks guy, and he's been working with Republican candidates for decades at this point. So we're pretty sure that Julian Assange reached out to Jerome Corsi, and Jerome Corsi at that point started talking with Roger Stone, and Roger Stone was talking with President Trump. Now, we believe this especially because Roger Stone and Jerome Corsi both made a whole bunch of public statements in the run-up to the election saying Julian Assange has a bunch of emails about Hillary Clinton, and he's going to release them in order to hurt Hillary Clinton's chance of being elected. And they said this publicly on Twitter repeatedly, saying that they had knowledge of it, that Roger Stone said he had knowledge of it, Jerome Corsi said he had knowledge of it. We had a few other Republican operatives who also said, oh, we know all about this, and Assange is going to put out these emails in order to influence the election. Now, the fact that we have some evidence that Corsi was talking with Assange and that Corsi was definitely talking with Roger Stone, and we know Roger Stone was talking with Donald Trump, and the fact that both Corsi and Stone put out public statements saying they know about what's going on with WikiLeaks, they've talked to WikiLeaks, they know what they're going to do, and they're coordinating with them, well, that looks like Corsi and Stone would therefore be guilty of collusion with a foreign government or with foreign actors to try and influence the election. Now, Corsi and Stone, in their defense, have said that when they said they knew what Julian Assange was doing and they knew about the WikiLeaks releases, they said they were lying when they said that they didn't actually know anything, and that they were just guessing, and they just happened to get right. They happened to get it right. They just guessed about what was going on, and so they didn't really know. And Roger Stone, of course, also was saying this in a bunch of emails that he knew was going to happen, but he has since said, oh, no, I was just lying about the whole thing. So both Stone and Corsi have said that they were lying about everything, and they didn't actually know anything. I think this is getting close to being literally incredible, that they happen to guess correctly about everything, but that's their story right now. Corsi, in order to try and cover his tracks, deleted all of his emails and got rid of scrubbed his computer so they couldn't find it. But apparently Mueller's team has still found them. Has still found all those emails where he's talking with other people about Julian Assange, about WikiLeaks, and about trying to coordinate with WikiLeaks to influence the election. So the last link here. So assuming we know that Corsi was talking with Julian Assange, we know that Stone was talking with Corsi, and we know that Stone was talking with Trump. Now, Stone has said he did not talk about this with Trump at all, but he's also said in the past he did not know anything about this, and both he and Corsi have claimed that when they did have conversations with WikiLeaks with people related to WikiLeaks, they claimed that when they lied about it in the past, they weren't lying, they had just literally forgotten all about it. They didn't remember they had all these conversations with everybody about them. Again, this seems relatively incredible. But the question then becomes, in terms of for American politics, well, what happens then? So we know Mueller basically has the goods on these guys. Their defense at this point, both Stone and Mueller, is that they were lying when they said they knew things. And while they did have communications that they had forgotten about, they've got with WikiLeaks about what was going on with the email releases, they had forgotten about all of those. They didn't intentionally lie to Robert Mueller when they said they knew anything about it. They had just forgotten all about it. Stone goes further into saying that he never had any conversations about that with Donald Trump. However, he did have lots and lots of conversations with Donald Trump. We have the phone records. So it's not at all clear that we'll be able to prove one way or the other what they were talking about. But it certainly is suggestive because, of course, Donald Trump did, after receiving some of these emails, did in fact start to talk about WikiLeaks and ask Russian hackers to release the emails, and said, of course, famously publicly, Russia, if you're listening, find Hillary Clinton's emails. We'll be very, very grateful if you do. All right, so that's our basic background here. So what's going on with Paul Manafort? Paul Manafort is a weird case right now. So Paul Manafort was Trump's campaign manager. And Manafort essentially was flipped on Donald Trump to Robert Mueller. Mueller essentially convinced Manafort that he was going to go to jail for lying and for collusion. And so Manafort, as well as actually a lot of tax fraud. So Manafort was getting all sorts of payments mostly from the Ukrainian government, and was laundering that money so he didn't have to register as a foreign agent. You're allowed to lobby for foreign governments in America. You're allowed to lobby Congress as a representative of foreign government, but you have to disclose that you're a lobbyist for a foreign government. Manafort didn't want to do that, so all the money he got in from Ukrainian and Russian oligarchs, he just laundered. And that's, of course, illegal. So Manafort pled guilty and agreed to turn state's evidence against Donald Trump and on behalf of Mueller in order to get a more lenient prison sentence. However, we just got filings earlier this week that Manafort, in fact, violated that plea agreement that Manafort, Mueller now believes, had actually lied to the government after agreeing to turn state's evidence, that he made material and repeated misrepresentations. And so Mueller's saying, well, we're going to take all the evidence he did, but he lied about a bunch of things, so now we're going to throw the book at him, and he's going to go to jail. So Manafort now has claimed, and Corsi has claimed this as well, that in fact the whole time he had a joint defense agreement with Donald Trump. Now, joint defense agreements, those of you who's taking law, you know what that is. Essentially, what it means is that if you've got two separate defendants in a case, two separate defendants in a criminal case, the lawyers for those defendants are allowed to sign a joint defense agreement. And the joint defense agreement means the lawyers are allowed to share information about the case with each other. Now, you're not allowed to do that, of course, because you can't violate your attorney-client confidentiality. But in a joint defense agreement, you're allowed to violate confidentiality because you're co-defendants, you're in the same boat together. Now, when one individual in a joint defense agreement turns state's evidence, the joint defense agreement is typically going to be dissolved, because if I'm now going to flip and testify against you, we no longer have the same interest anymore. So therefore, my lawyer can't coordinate with your lawyer anymore, because we don't have the same interests, and it would be unethical for my lawyer to try and do what your lawyer wants him to do. So Manafort and Corsi both are now claiming that they maintained their joint defense agreements with Donald Trump after they flipped. And that's a huge deal, because that essentially means that Trump and Trump's lawyers would be getting information about the Mueller investigation after they weren't supposed to be getting it anymore. So essentially Manafort would have been leaking stuff to Trump's defense team when he wasn't supposed to be doing that, and that certainly will piss off Robert Mueller. All right, so I'm going through some of the questions. We got a lot here, which is excellent. So what consequences will Manafort face for violating the agreement? So Manafort was going to get a time off the sentence for turning state's evidence, and now he's not going to. So it's likely he's going to go to jail at this point for, the jail sentence is anything more than about 10, 15 years. For someone like Paul Manafort, that is in fact a life sentence. He's a relatively older man, so he'll probably go to jail for the rest of his life as a result. The speculation, of course, is that Manafort isn't worried about that because he believes he'll get a pardon from Donald Trump in return for doing this. And a lot of commentators have argued that this is, in fact, pretty much a naked play to try and get a pardon, because I'll lie to Mueller and I won't tell him the stuff you don't want me to tell him, but he wants to get a pardon in return. And the pardon would, of course, stop him from having to serve jail time for any federal crimes, although he could still be tried on state charges. So what consequences Manafort face for violating this agreement? He'll get a longer federal prison term, but of course the president could remove that prison term whenever he wants. All right, so Amy's asking, do you think that Trump will actually pardon him? The answer is that if you can predict what Donald Trump is going to do, I think you can make a lot of money. Trump's lawyers apparently have persuaded him to not pardon anybody until after the investigation is over. But once the investigation is over, I think that it's entirely likely he will. He'll probably pardon some people. The reason not to pardon him is that it would look really bad politically. If you start issuing pardons in the middle of investigation, someone basically obstructs justice and you pardon him, that's going to look really bad for you. And it could cause Congress to start looking at impeachment hearings. But if you're not worried about that, if you're going to resign anyway, or if you just say, you know what, I'm betting Republicans in the Senate are never going to turn against me, then you might as well pardon him in order to try and shut down the investigation. So Manafort is, Neil's asking about Manafort's state charges. Manafort is facing state charges in both Virginia and New York. They don't carry quite as much of a penalty. And we should note Manafort has already given up tens of millions of dollars in assets, about $40 million in assets, simply because it was all due to laundered money, and he's not going to get that back regardless. Ian's asking, what do you think about Jerome Corsi's interview from last night? So Jerome Corsi is this guy who works with mostly with Roger Stone and was peripherally involved in this. And Corsi actually wrote a book about how Robert Mueller is abusing his power. And the big way that Corsi argues that Mueller is abusing his power is that he is indicting people for not telling the truth. So Corsi's argument in the book, which I would not recommend you read, it's not great. It's only about 70 pages, but it's not great. Corsi's argument is that that Mueller expects you to ask you a bunch of questions. If you don't give the right answers, there's the answers he expects you to give, the answers that are backed up by the evidence, then he's going to say you're lying. He's going to throw you in jail for lying. So Corsi claims that, oh, well, I did have a bunch of emails about WikiLeaks with the WikiLeaks people and with Roger Stone about that, but I never lied about it. I just forgot all about it and then destroyed my computer so that no one would be able to find out about it. But I just forgot it was purely innocent. And as a result, so I'm going to go to jail. And so Corsi essentially saying, well, I'm not going to play ball with Mueller no matter what. Now, Corsi saying, oh, there was a plea offer and all that. We have no idea if there actually was or not because Robert Mueller doesn't leak anything. So everything we get is, in fact, from Corsi. Again, this looks to most people like kind of a naked play to try and get a pardon. Neil's asking if the president can pardon state crimes. The president cannot pardon state crimes. So any crimes committed against New York or Virginia, the president has nothing to do with that. He can't pardon that. So George asking, couldn't Trump use the pardoning as a sign of victory, freeing an innocent man? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, saying this person never should be prosecuted. This is all a illegal witch hunt, something, so I'm going to pardon him. But again, that looks really bad. It becomes very hard to defend if this person admitted to obstructing justice, admitted to laundering money, and you're just going to say, well, but I like him, so I'm not going to pardon him. It's really, really hard to justify that. There's not a strong argument made for pardoning someone who pled guilty to crimes and pled guilty to serious crimes. All right, so keep going through. So Dan's asking, can Manafort be charged something on a non-federal level the president could address? Yes, and Manafort already has been charged with non-federal crimes. The state of New York especially is looking into this in order to try and basically go for all of these people that are involved in the Russia collusion and get them on financial crimes. There's a lot of money laundering involved. It's actually not clear if they're allowed to do that under New York law because it looks like it might be a violation of double jeopardy. That is, if you're pardoned on the federal level for a crime, can you be tried on the state level? And in the New York State Constitution, New York State law, it's not clear if that's true or not. So New York State legislature is actually trying to change that law now so they will be able to try him afterwards. Can Trump, Donnie's asking, can the president pardon himself? The answer is nobody knows. No one's ever tried. We don't think so, but there's no rule that says you can't. And again, if you can figure out what Donald Trump's going to do, you are a smarter person than I am. All right, so let's see. I'm going through the rest of the questions. If we've got what's going on there. So what do you think of Ian's asking? What do you think of Jerome Corsi's interview from last night? He sounds like a crazy person who wants a pardon. What can happen to Trump if there's others going to jail, but he's not? So straight, that's a very good question. So we expect Mueller's investigation to wrap up at any time. And we really don't know at this point, but at some point Mueller's investigation will wrap up, at least part of it will. And what we expect is that there'll be a lot of people close to Trump, either political or literally his family, who are going to be indicted. However, it is believed, the Justice Department argues that they cannot actually indict a sitting president. Why is that? The idea is there'll be a violation of separation of powers, that essentially if the Justice Department, the judiciary can put the president on trial, then they could have too much power of the president. The president wouldn't be able to fulfill his constitutional duties if he was under indictment. So therefore, it's thought that the Justice Department believes, and this goes back to Richard Nixon Watergate, that they cannot indict the sitting president. So what happens if basically the president's family and the president's business associates all go to jail and he doesn't? Nobody knows. Never happened before. There certainly would be a lot of call for impeachment. The president certainly would feel a lot of pressure to start pardoning people. That would lead to more pressure for impeachment. But it leads all very, very clearly to a constitutional crisis where things are, that's why I said after election, things are going to get much, much worse before they get better. I think we are headed very much for that sort of constitutional crisis. All right. And see you guys. Anything else? And we should Ian's asking, both Ians are asking about Ukraine and what's going on with Russia. Yeah, because that's going on also right now. This whole thing with Russia is complicated by the fact that Russia just sank about a third of Ukraine's navy, actually more than that. And it looks like Russia's engaging in open hostilities with Ukraine again. So what's going on there? Russia at this point is fairly, I think, everyone's distracted enough that they can get away with going after Ukraine right now, and no one's going to do anything. And they're probably right. I mean, there's not much that anyone can do at this point. The president is not going to stand up to them. Angela Merkel is weakened. No one really has the stamina or the willpower right now to do anything about what's going on in Ukraine with Russia. So Russia is going to take the opportunity to strengthen their hand in Ukraine. As a consequence, President has said he's not going to meet with Vladimir Putin at the G20, but that's not really much of a problem. So he's asking, is the worst that can happen to the president is impeachment? I wouldn't say it's the worst that can happen. I would say that basically the only thing that can happen to the president. The president can be impeached, and that's just it. And there's nothing else going on there. Diana's noting that the Senate wouldn't impeach him even if the House did. We should just know in terminology. So the House is the one that does the impeachment. So the House of Representatives, in order to impeach the president, has a majority vote. In majority vote, they impeach. And so if the president is impeached, it then goes to the Senate for a trial. So Bill Clinton was impeached. The House of Representatives in majority vote has it over to the Senate. So that's impeachment. However, he's not being removed. So the Senate has to have a 2/3 vote to remove him. And that's what seems unlikely. The president, it's hard to know what the president would have to do for all 40, at this point, 47 Democrats and 20 Republicans to all agree to remove the president from office. The Democrats don't seem to have very much of an appetite for it because even if you remove him from office, you replace him with Mike Pence. It's not sure that's necessarily a benefit for anybody. Democrats seem very content, via Nancy Pelosi, to just wait it out. Basically, hamstring him for 2 years, and then at the end of 2 years, all we're going to do is just vote him out of office. And it's thought that's a much better way to go about this than to actually try and remove him from office. Okay, so we got there. Do we think Ukraine will eventually be invaded by Russia? Annexed by Russia? No, I don't think they'll formally. I don't think Ukraine will formally be annexed by Russia because that would be causing international outcry. At this point, I think might be informally annexed by Russia. Russia might take over the government and basically make it as a vassal state, but I don't think they're going to formally do anything because that would get them in trouble. And they can do things quietly, and as long as they do things quietly, no one's going to say boo to them. Okay, one more note for Serena. She said worst happens impeachment. After the president is out of office, of course, the government can pursue charges against him as they would against any private citizen. So if the president doesn't pardon himself as president, the Justice Department can come after him. Robert Mueller's investigation team, the FBI, can actually investigate him and could indict him and could in theory send him to jail. I think it's actually more likely that the state of New York would do it. State of New York has been very aggressive at pursuing President Trump because politically they don't like him, and a lot of the bad stuff he did was while he was in New York. So he could go to jail after he leaves office, but while he's in office, he certainly can't go to jail. We don't think he can be charged with a crime. Although you could actually charge him with a crime, say we're going to charge him now, but we're not going to indict him. We're not going to have a formal indictment until after he leaves office. The podcast has a lot of questions about what's going to happen next. The answer is nobody knows. And the reason we don't know is that Robert Mueller doesn't talk. He doesn't leak anything. We have no idea what's going on inside Mueller's investigation, aside from the public statements that we get. Mueller is being a little more open just because we're getting more documents out of him. So he's being much more open about the fact that Manafort was talking with Trump. So President Trump is never named in any of the indictments. He's always person number one who was running for president and then eventually became president, or person number one who ran over a large real estate company in New York. It's Donald Trump. And so it's become a little more clear that he's getting close to Donald Trump. So Dan's saying, what's going on with the taxes? So Donald Trump it does seem like he committed. New York Times was able to show pretty conclusively that he committed very large-scale tax fraud in the order of hundreds of millions of dollars, and it seems likely the state of New York, if not the federal government, will go after him for that eventually. Although, really, for future presidents, it's actually really hard to do that. I mean, imagine if you're a future Republican president, you're not going to go back and say, "Oh yeah, let's pardon this guy." The reason you wouldn't do that is because Jerry Ford did that. He pardoned Richard Nixon, and it was basically the end of his political career. In addition, you're a Democratic president, and you go back and you want to go and pursue indictments and charge him. It looks bad. It looks like you're pursuing a political agenda, and you don't want anyone to do that to you. So there's kind of this expectation that presidents don't go after past presidents. Even though when Barack Obama took office, there was a lot of push to really investigate and perhaps put George Bush or Dick Cheney on trial, and they just said immediately, we're not going to do that because it would raise too many problems, cause too much bad blood. All right, where we're going next. Got Bloomberg. Oh, we already did Bloomberg. I've got we already did Mueller. I've got education policy. I've got wildfires. I've got the Moynihan report, and I've got sex and birth rates. Help me out. Let me know. We'll take a minute. You guys can vote and tell me what you want to talk about next. Education, wildfire. I get Ian saying education. Amy saying wildfires. Wildfires. Wildfires are in. Let's get a couple more votes in, and we can talk a little bit about wildfires or ed policy. All right, looks like a bunch of people want to talk about the wildfires in California. So I'll do a little background while I do a little bit of background. George, don't worry, we're gonna get to it. George, we're gonna get to the Moynihan report. I think that's very interesting. I do want to talk about it. I think it also ties into discussion. I think it was from the cocktail chatter about sex and birth rates. All right, so I'll start giving background. While I'm giving background, questions you have, go over in the chat window. I think it's on that side for me. I don't know if it's on that side for you. All right, so let's talk a little about what's going on with the wildfires in California. So the wildfires in California and more recently Arizona. The wildfires in California were the most destructive wildfires in the history of California. Ian saying you're just supposed to rake up with the leaves in national forest, and that's a great idea. Now, what caused these sort of wildfires? Well, in one sense, it's weather, right? So weather caused them in that they had a series of very dry years. Then they had a whole lot of rain this past year. And once you have a whole bunch of rain in 1 year, that leads to a whole bunch of weeds and all this stuff sprouting up. And then it got hot again. So they all died. Leaving a lot of tinder on the forest floor and leading to increased wildfire risks. So when wildfire did break out, it would be as devastating as usual. So Ian is referencing, when he says you're supposed to rake it, he's referencing the president's much mocked comments. When he was asked about the wildfires, the president said that what you're supposed to do is rake up the leaves. Initially, he had said that this was something he had been talking to a governor in the western state, and the governor said, well, we rake the leaves up and it doesn't cause any problems. Then he changed his story, and the president in the next day said he had been talking with the president of Finland, and the president of Finland says that they're a forested country, they've got lots of forest, they don't have a problem because they too also rake up their leaves. This led to the Finnish president to issue a statement saying he had no idea what the president was talking about, that they do not, in fact, rake their leaves in Finland. The reason they don't have wildfires in Finland is because it is a very cold country and they have lots of snow. So they don't really get wildfires. Moreover, the president's comments were much mocked because raking up the national forest in the United States would be a monumental task. So if we had, for instance, if all of us decided tomorrow that we wanted to rake up all the leaves in all the national forests of America, you could take the entire population of the United States, give us some rakes and some leaf bags, and we could get the whole thing done in about 100 days a year. So if we mobilize the entire population of the United States, we think we could probably get it done in about 100 days per year. So we could spend about a quarter of our national labor raking leaves. Then, of course, we'd have to somehow get rid of those leaves. The leaves from 1 year in the United States National Forest would constitute a cube somewhere around 2.1 miles on each side. So I don't know where exactly we're going to put those. So the point is that forest management is an issue, but there's not necessarily a whole lot we can do about these wildfires happening. The big issue with wildfires, we believe that they are in fact caused by or made worse by global climate change. That is the reason we have so many dry years followed by so many wet years. We have all this going on. The reason that's happening is because of climate change, because the climate is getting weirder. It's getting more extreme. And the president, of course, argues that that has nothing to do with it, mostly because the president and Republicans in general argue that climate change is not actually a real thing. So if climate change is not a real thing, and the reason for that, they believe that, is because the policies that would be needed to address climate change would be potentially harmful to the economy and harmful to certain sectors of the economy, and they don't want to have that. So this becomes what we call motivated reasoning. If I choose to believe that we can't pursue the solutions that would be required in order to fix global climate change, I have to find a reason why that's acceptable to say, and I'll settle on the idea that, well, I'm just going to argue that climate change isn't real, or if it is real, it's not man-made, or if it is real and man-made, there's nothing we can do about it in order to avoid having to actually do anything about climate change. So we have to ask, all right, if let's say tomorrow we decide we did want to address climate change, what would we actually do? Well, the number one thing you would have to do, and we usually all agree on this, is we'd have to get rid of coal. We'd have to stop using coal somewhere around 10 years ago. The idea is coal is the most dirty burning of the fossil fuels we have. Now, of course, there are certain types of coal that are better than others. So the sort of coal we get in the United States is actually relatively clean. The sort of coal that you use in China is relatively dirtier than the one we use. And the dirtiest in the world is actually peat moss, which is mostly over in Scotland, in the United Kingdom, and they actually don't use it all anymore. As Diana pointed out, this was all made quite a bit, this is all put into relief by the fact that on Black Friday, the administration put out a climate change report. The government is required to put out a climate change report every 4 years. The EPA put out the climate change report. It was released on Black Friday in order to try and bury it so it wouldn't get news coverage. Didn't work that well in that we still got quite a bit of news coverage, but we put out a climate change report saying climate change is real, it's devastating, and it is going to lead to enormous hardships for the American people and potentially reduce the size of the economy by about 10% by the year 2100 if we don't do something right now about it. I actually don't like it when they talk about, it's going to hurt the economy, because climate change, yeah, I'm sure it'll hurt the economy, but it's also going to kill a lot of people. And so as far as I'm concerned, just from a moral perspective and policy perspective, we should be putting more emphasis on the people it's going to be killing and the property it's going to be destroying, lives it's going to be destroying, rather than the amount of money it's going to cost. So why do we think climate change is going to cost so much money? Why do you think it's going to be such a big problem for the United States? Well, part of it is increased risk of extreme weather events. So that can be stuff like the wildfires, but it can also just be hurricanes. We just get more hurricanes, we get more droughts, and all of that causes real hardship for Americans. Also, ocean level rises. As ocean level rises, places that that are close to the water have to evacuate. Either they have to spend billions of dollars trying to raise the level, or they have to just leave. And it's not clear which we're going to do. So let's say we decide Miami Beach just becomes uninhabitable. So if the ocean level rises by a foot, Miami Beach is entirely underwater. Miami Beach is doing everything they can to try and build seawalls and do stuff, but it's probably not going to work. So what do? Do you pay everyone in Miami Beach to relocate? Do you just call it do you make the insurance companies pay out? What do? Does the flood insurance program just expand to cover everybody? Do you force people to move to a different state or higher ground? What do you have places that haven't gone underwater yet, but we're about to go underwater? Do you force them to move? Does the federal government buy them out? And these are real interesting policy questions. So we've actually already had some problems with this. So in New Jersey, we're actually pretty familiar with this. So in New Jersey, we had Hurricane Sandy come. When Hurricane Sandy came, a lot of towns on the Jersey Shore decided what they needed to do was build up their dunes and build up more beach in order so if we did get storm surge, the storm surge wouldn't be quite as devastating. All right, that's reasonable. The problem was people live there. So what do? Well, those towns said, well, we are taking your house. We're just going to bulldoze it. We're going to get rid of it because we need more beach here. And your house can't be here anymore. So who pays for that? Is the city pay for it? Does the state pay for it? Does the homeowner? Does the insurance company? Right? Who is supposed to be paying for all of this? And it's one thing when it's a few $1 million here and there to buy out a few homeowners in New Jersey or in Miami. But what if it's tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people? What if it's entire towns that we have to move? One of the things that was, I think, underappreciated in the climate change report that came out last week was the idea that there's going to be large communities that are going to have to move. They talked in particular about the Jersey Shore and people having to leave the Jersey Shore and the costs and consequences of relocating entire cities away from the waters to somewhere else. And can you imagine what happens if, Snooki in the situation, all those other Jersey Shore people are suddenly have to move to Delaware or something? I mean, that'd be terrifying for the people in Delaware. So there's all sorts of costs associated with it, and no one's quite clear about how we're supposed to deal with these costs or who's going to be paying for it. And no one has the money to pay for it at this point. All right, so if we want to address this, what do we do? As we already said, the first thing we do is get rid of coal. Stop using coal altogether. Now, can we do that? The answer is yeah, absolutely. We can do it in the United States for a couple of reasons. Number one, because we have a lot of coal in the United States, but we actually are already weaning ourselves off of coal. This is one of those weird things. So the United States did get out of the Paris Climate Change Accord. We decided we weren't going to be part of it anymore because Donald Trump didn't want to be part of it anymore. That's fine. But it looks like we're actually going to meet our goals on the Paris Climate Change Accord basically without even being part of it because our big goal was to stop using coal. And coal, well, we're not using it very much anymore. Not because we decided coal is bad for the environment. Rather, it's because natural gas is a heck of a lot cheaper and burns much cleaner. And so coal just isn't a profitable business in the United States anymore. Coal increasingly relies on government subsidies to keep it a business. And so if we just get rid of the government subsidies, or if we keep government subsidies at the current level and don't increase them, we're going to phase out using coal either way. The market itself is working, and we're just going to stop using coal. Now, I think there's a much stronger argument made for a climate tax or a carbon tax. And the carbon tax, we've talked about this before, essentially works as a Pigovian tax on fossil fuels. So fossil fuels, we know, have enormous negative externalities. That is, when you burn them, you release carbon in the atmosphere. That causes all these other problems for other people. So if you have a Pigovian tax on carbon, on fossil fuels, that would make them much more expensive. And that, in turn, would reduce our use not just of coal, but of natural gas and of really any other fossil fuel. And that would essentially make solar energy and wind energy, geothermal energy, wave-based energy much more feasible because they'd now be similar in price. Now, that's not going to happen anytime soon, but it does look like we are moving towards replacing coal with natural gas, assuming we don't do something spectacularly stupid, like start to increase our subsidies for coal, which, by the way, is what the government is looking at doing, because that would be the dumbest thing. Now, here's the problem. Let's say the United States decides tomorrow we're going to do everything we can to wean ourselves off of coal. We're going to stop using coal tomorrow. In fact, we're going to reduce our use of natural gas as well, because it's still responsible for climate change. We're going to reduce our cattle herds. Cow farts in the form of methane are also a major factor in climate change. So we're going to do all of that. The United States will do everything we possibly can in order to reduce the effect of climate change. We didn't solve the problem. Because even if we solve the problem ourselves, well, we're not the biggest problem here. Now, the United States, we have the most fossil fuel outputs and carbon outputs on a per capita basis. But while we have most on a per capita basis, well, it's not going to make much of a difference because we don't have the most people. The real fight over climate change is not happening in the United States. It's happening in India and in China. So China burns much dirtier coal than we do, and they're still building a whole lot of coal plants. They're going to be increasing their use of coal going forward. So we've got that as a problem. So if India and China don't change their ways, it doesn't matter what the United States does. Now, in past negotiations, India and China basically said, look, we are willing to reduce the amount of coal we use. China actually is a bit more willing than India is. This largely because India is a democracy, and so they know it's very politically unpopular to reduce coal because coal is where a lot of people get, a lot of people in India, rural India, just got electricity like 10 minutes ago based on coal, and to take that away, that'd be politically devastating for them. So China is saying, okay, we might be willing to cut our coal outputs, but we want you to do it first. The argument they make is that the United States, you can afford it, right? China's still a relatively poor country. Since they're a relatively poor country, they said, look, we can't afford all of these other fuels. You guys can afford to pay more for your energy. You can afford to pay for solar and wind and nuclear, whatever. We're a poor country. We can afford coal, and that's about it. And if we want our people to have energy, we've got to use coal. So China's agreed to cut things down if we cut down first, and we've been at an impasse because America has rightly said, you guys put out way more carbon than we do. Right? The United States, we're a problem. We're not the problem. The big problem really is China. And so you guys have to cut first. And China's saying, yeah, we know we've got high emissions, but we've got lower per capita emissions than the United States does. And you guys are richer, so you can afford to cut first. And essentially what's happening is nobody's cutting because we're at this impasse with China over it. And the current diplomatic situation with China is not making it any more likely that we'll actually be able to do anything about it. So Amy's asking, if we stop using coal right now, how much would it really help? It would help. I mean, I wouldn't say if just the United States stopped using coal, but if everybody stopped using coal, so if China and India and everybody else stopped using coal and switched over to other energy sources, yes, it would make a huge difference. You could probably still stop the very worst of it. You probably couldn't stop us from getting to 1.1, 1.2 degrees of global warming, but you might be able to stop at 1.5. You certainly might be able to avoid us getting to 2 or 3 degrees of global warming, where things get really, really, really bad. And that's a world that I don't think any of us really want to live in. We've got that much global climate change. This is also an example of a very close to being a pure collective action problem. So I think if you take a political science class before, we've talked quite a bit about collective action problems. But the basic idea is that all of us recognize we are better off if everybody stops using coal, everybody stops using fossil fuels, and we just all switch to solar or wind or other renewable energy sources. We are all better off if we do that. But what's better than that is if the rest of y'all switch, and I get to keep on using coal or keep on using natural gas or keep on using my fossil fuels because it'll be cheaper for me. I have all infrastructure built around that. So everyone's waiting for the other people to move first. No one wants to be the sucker. And it's absolutely true that if everybody but the United States switches over to renewable sources and carbon taxes and all that, we can keep on doing exactly what we're doing now. Nothing bad's going to happen. We'll be able to avoid the worst of global warming as long as we're the only ones who still keep on doing exactly what we're doing now. The problem is, of course, that everybody wants to be the guy that keeps on doing exactly what they're doing now and doesn't actually change anything, because changing these things costs a lot of money. So you're saying, so if the U.S. was the only one to stop using coal, there'd be no difference at all. There'd be a marginal difference, there'd be a bit of a difference, but it wouldn't be enough to prevent the worst effects of global climate change. If we want the worst effects of global climate change to be avoided, we would have to stop using coal ourselves, and we'd have to somehow convince India and China to also stop using coal, and at least to stop opening up new coal-fired plants. Why are we doing it? Because, again, economics. Because it would cost us a lot of money. Now, there's actually an argument to be made that it would be much better for us in the long term to do that. Why? Well, because it creates a lot of jobs. So if we decide tomorrow we're going to move everything to solar and wind-based energy, well, that's going to take a lot of jobs to replace our current infrastructure. There'll be a lot of money spent and a lot of good-paying, probably union jobs. However, that money has to come from somewhere. And right now, energy companies have a lot of money invested in the system and the way things are working now, and they don't especially want to change. Dan is asking, do we essentially have to wait for world governments to get it, world governments to get its act together? Look, the world governments have already gotten their act together to some extent. That's what the Paris Climate Change Accord is about, saying, look, this is what we need to do. We're all going to agree to do this. The problem is that there's no body that can actually force governments to do something that they don't want to do. This is the basis of the principle of sovereignty. Sovereignty means, this goes back to Treaty of Westphalia in 1600s, sovereignty means that no one government can tell other governments what to do. There is no force that's above the power of a sovereign government. So governments can't make other governments do it. So I can't force them to. We have to rely on their cooperation. And in a prisoner's dilemma game, like what we're in, a collective action game, it's very hard to get this sort of cooperation. You get the cooperation by moving in small steps, right? By building up a little cooperation and moving forward on that basis. And so there are governments who have made positive steps to do it. I mean, most European governments have already put together what's called a cap and trade system, where they have, what amounts to a market-based climate tax. So if you want to burn carbon, you have to buy the right to burn carbon from equivalent of a stock exchange. And so in places that are burning and decide not to burn anymore can sell it on that same stock exchange. The United States had looked into doing that, but we decided against doing it. I decided against doing it because it would make coal-fired plants much harder for us to run. And we don't want that because coal plants, because power plants have a lot of political sway, and because coal itself, as kind of a masculine macho job in West Virginia, has some sort of symbolic power. So the world governments, even if they all get together, the world governments already know what they're doing. The problem is if some people decide they want to not be the sucker, and some governments decide, look, I don't want to change what I'm doing, I want to be the one guy who doesn't have to change, there's nothing we can do about that. I mean, and it's not clear how we would assert ourselves to force other governments to do it, and how we're going to make China switch from coal-fired plants. Start bombing their coal plants. We're going to put sanctions on every government that uses coal-fired plants. I don't know what we're supposed to do with that, no one's figured that out yet. If there's going to be a solution to this, I have to say I'm a bit pessimistic about the ability of governments to actually solve this problem. If we're going to have a solution to this, I think the big solution is going to come from technology. That is, when it becomes clear that solar power generates a lot of jobs and gets to the point where it's cheaper than gas, yeah, regardless for solar power because it's cheaper. I believe in markets, but I don't believe governments have the ability to actually get their act together and figure this stuff out. Now, governments could certainly help with this process. That is, governments could decide tomorrow, we're actually going to go ahead and put the Pigovian tax we talked about in the past on fossil fuels. If we put the Pigovian tax on fossil fuels and therefore force companies and consumers to bear the negative externalities, financially bear the negative externalities of carbon, then yeah, it would happen much, much faster. Mostly because if they did that, then solar energy and wind energy would be much cheaper relative to everything else. Is that going to happen though? That is possible. Now, this is dumb, but as it turns out, subsidies are actually a lot easier for governments to pursue than taxes. So rather than you put a Pigovian tax on oil and natural gas and coal, I think it's actually much more likely that we would give subsidies to solar and wind power. Now, in terms of economics, if I take solar and wind power and I make them cheaper, artificially cheaper than subsidies, that is the same thing as taking coal and natural gas and making them artificially expensive, basically using Pigovian taxes to make the cost of coal and natural gas reflect their true cost to society. Either way, I've evened out the cost. The difference is that if I put taxes on coal and natural gas, I reduce the people's willingness to buy those, and I raise money for the government. If I put subsidies to reduce the cost of solar and wind and all that, I'm spending government money. Now, the net effect is the same. And if we're being purely rational, we should be indifferent between the two of them. We'd be better off as a society, perhaps as a government, if we put the carbon tax because we then are collecting money rather than spending money. But economically, it doesn't make much of a difference. I think it's much more likely, however, that we will be willing to put a subsidy to artificially reduce the cost of renewable energy sources than to actually tax coal and natural gas. And if you make the subsidy big enough, then coal and natural gas go away on their own. That said, coal, natural gas, and electricity providers who are caught up in the current system, the current infrastructure, have pushed back very hard against big subsidies for solar, natural gas, and solar and wind power, arguing that it will put them out of business. And they're right. But this is business that probably do need to eventually go out of business. Related to this, we did see a big movement on the part of auto manufacturers in the past couple of days, in fact, the past week, arguing that the future of cars is going to be all electric cars rather than having internal combustion engines that use gasoline. And so they're shutting down plants and things like that in order to refocus on building electric cars. And I think we are underestimating to a great extent the political and social effects of moving to electric cars. So just off the top of my head, there's no such thing as a gas station anymore because you don't need it. And in fact, if you have electric cars, there's probably no such thing as automobile repair anymore. Because if you've ever seen the inside of an electric car, here in New Jersey, you can go to a mall where they have a Tesla showroom and look at the inside of it. There aren't any moving parts. It's like an iPod in there. Like there's just some electric motors and there's nothing really to break down. And so it means you don't have auto shops anymore. Well, why do we care about that? Because gas stations and auto shops employ hundreds of thousands or millions of Americans. So those people are just out of jobs. And what are they going to be trained with? I don't know. Because we have car mechanics for 100 years now in the United States, and they're going to be suddenly out of a job. Combine that with self-driving cars, where you're putting everyone who drives a taxi cab, everyone who ever drives a truck out of work as well, and you're looking at millions of people, mostly men, who have been displaced from the workforce. What are you doing with it? I don't know. We've got, of course, both political parties have solutions to that, but it's not clear that any of those solutions are actually going to be able to be put into effect. So, getting back to wildfires, what's the responsibility here? Well, and the big responsibility is to try and reduce the amount of global climate change, so this doesn't happen quite as often. in terms of government, levels of government, it is the federal government that runs almost all the national forests and has been underfunded over the years, right? They don't spend enough money on this, on cleaning up forests, on doing controlled burns, things like that, especially in California, because they are potentially dangerous. So the federal government has dropped the ball. The state government doesn't control very much of it. It's not clear what they could be doing differently, but of course that didn't stop the president from blaming them, saying the state government should be doing more to try and fix this. All right, I'm going to put this back up. We finish up with wildfires. So I've still got education policy, I've got the Moynihan Report, and I've got sex and birth rates. So you tell me which of those you want to go to next. All right, guys, so here's what we're going to do. Let's talk about education policy, and then we're going to move on to the Moynihan Report. All right, so I'll start with a brief intro, and then you guys can put over in the comments particular questions you have about education policy. So I do want to start off by talking mostly about K through 12 education policy. Something because you folks know quite a bit about, as you've recently been through K through 12. At least I hope. I mean, I don't know if they checked your high school diploma for let you in here or not. And America has a very weird system. I want to approach this almost the way we approach healthcare, saying, all right, here's our system. And I think we tend to take our system as a granted, like this is the way people do things. But we should know it is not. So I want to talk about the way other countries run their education policies and their education systems and see how it's different. And maybe if there are better ideas for how to run things. So in the US, our education system is run, K through 12 education is run on the local level. That is, individual municipalities, sometimes at the level of counties, are going to run their own school districts. Within those school districts, they have a broad latitude to set their own policies. Budgets for K through 12 education in the United States dominantly come from property taxes. So rather than having states funded through income taxes, basically you get levied a tax. All property owners within the municipality or within the school district pay a tax based on the value of their home, and that tax is then used to fund the schools. Attendance at given schools is based entirely on geography. Where you live is where you go to school. Now, there are exceptions to this. There are what are called magnet schools and charter schools, those schools that operate within a school district, but do not operate geographically within that school district. That is, they draw students from across the school district, not necessarily from one small geographical portion of that school district. We don't actually in the United States, we have a long history of rejecting what's called tracking. So as recently as 20 or 30 years ago, there was a great deal of tracking in use in American high schools and middle schools. The idea was that students who showed more promise would be moved up into more advanced classes earlier and put on a separate track than students who were not showing as much promise. Now, the reason we started getting rid of those sort of tracking programs, or at least most schools became less aggressive about tracking, so I'm guessing you folks weren't tracked nearly as hard as people my generation were, is because in many areas, the tracking programs had profoundly racist effects. That is, that tracking programs were used as a way to segregate students, in whether they were just on purpose trying to segregate students on a racial basis or were doing it as an unintentional consequence. It essentially meant that within schools, even schools that were racially integrated, the tracks within those schools were not racially integrated. White students were put into the higher tracks, minority students were put into the lesser tracks, and so you had a breakdown of racial integration within the school, even if the school itself was racially integrated. Now, at the end of K-12 education in the United States, we go to college. How do you go to college? Well, again, most students in the United States now apply to college, although we should note most students in the United States do not actually complete college. So the modal group is people who complete college. There's about a little more than a third of people in your generation we expect are going to complete college, I think up to about 40%, especially among young women. But you also have a large group of people, somewhere around 20% of students who go to college for some time, but don't actually complete it. And then another group that never goes to college at all. All right, how do you get into college? In the United States, we get into college through the use of standardized tests run by private companies, mostly the SAT and the ACT. And colleges use those tests along with individualized admissions process to determine who is going to get in. In the admissions process, certain groups get favored. People have more money and will get in for reasons we just talked about a few minutes ago. In addition, people from some racial minority groups may receive benefits under affirmative action programs, making them more likely to get in. Most importantly, the biggest beneficiaries of affirmative action in the United States, of course, are white men, because men are part of college athletics programs, and college athletics programs are one of the major sources of scholarships for American students. Also, schools try and achieve a gender balance in their incoming classes. No one wants to go to schools 80% men or schools 80% women. And so they try to achieve gender balance. In order to do that, since young men in America have lower test scores in general than young women do, we give extra points to young men to try and get some sort of gender balance in our higher education. Who pays for higher education? Well, as you all know, higher education is paid for by the individual, mostly with federally subsidized government loans. So most students, they take out some form of federally subsidized government loans. I mean, the government essentially giving a bank money in order to give you a loan. Now, the system we have now, and again, a system you guys are probably pretty familiar with, but there's plenty of other ways you could be running the system, and the other countries do it, that seems to be relatively more effective. So let's start off with a system like the one we're going to use. Let's say a country with a more meritocratic system. So a meritocratic system would be one in which we put a greater emphasis on actual student achievement. So if we were in Japan, we were in Turkey, we were in South Korea, we'd be in a much more meritocratic system. So the way it's going to work is all students are going to go to a kindergarten and maybe a K-3 or K-4 program that is run by the government. They're not going to have almost nowhere else in the world is going to have the sort of federal system we have, where you have a whole bunch of different municipalities all running their own education systems. Guys, just a reminder, I do need you to start putting whatever your questions are on education policy over in the corner, and I'll get to those once we're done with this intro. Anyway, we're kind of unique in that we're doing federalist. We have a federal system where municipalities are going to run their own systems. If in these sort of more meritocratic systems, what you're going to see is the K-3 or K-4 is going to be run by the central federal government. The central government is going to run those. You're going to have standardized curriculum and standardized testing throughout those. At the end of this portion, the early portion of education, students are then going to be given a test. And the test could be as early as second or third grade. It could be as late as fourth or fifth grade. But essentially, students are going to be given a test. And students who do well on the test are then going to go to a better middle school. Students who worse on the test are going to go to a worse middle school. And so your score on your test when you're in somewhere between third and fifth grade is going to determine what sort of middle school you go to. Then at the end of middle school, you're going to take another test. And if you do well on the test, you go to a good high school. If you do poorly on the test, you go to a bad high school. And it's going to be measured in between. Basically, the students who score higher on the test are going to wind up with better educational resources. They wind up better schools with better teachers, with stronger curriculums, with harder classes. Students do worse, wind up in worse schools. Students do very badly, might not go to high school at all. Might be told, yeah, you just suck. We're kicking you out. It's not worth investing any more money in you. World needs taxi cab drivers and burger flippers. Have fun. So in these sort of meritocratic countries, you're then going to be put into a school based on your score on these standardized tests. And these standardized tests are going to be a big deal. If you're in Japan or you're in South Korea, you might spend several years cramming, going to cram school on a regular basis in order to do well on this test. Now, at the end of your high school, you've got to take another test, basically a college admissions test. And in places like Japan or Turkey, South Korea, your score is going to determine exactly which college you go to. People with the highest scores go to the best colleges. So if you're in Japan, you're in the top 1% or in the top 1,000 people in the entire country. Congratulations, you get into the University of Tokyo. And there's the only way in. You have to be one of the top scores on that test. If you're in Turkey, you're one of the top 1,000 scores, you're going to go to Boğaziçi University. And in fact, in many of these cases, your major is going to be selected based on how well your score was. So if you want to be an engineering major, you're going to have to score not just in the top 1,000 people. Maybe if you want to be an engineering student at Tokyo University, you're going to have to be in the top 100 because that's going to be the most demanding major. And maybe you want to be a political science major. Well, that requires a higher score than being a sociology major, requires a higher score than being an anthropology major, and so on and so forth. So the benefits of a system like this is that it is highly meritocratic. That is, the best students, regardless of how much money they have, get to go to the best schools. It'd be like if poor kids and rich kids had an equal chance of going to Harvard. Just the people who got the best scores in the SATs in the whole country, they all got into Harvard. And as you know, that's not the way Harvard works, the way Ivy League schools work, right? We don't give the best students the best schools. Rather, we give the students who get into Harvard or Princeton or Yale aren't the best students. They're the students who are very good students, who also have political connections or have social connections or have a lot of money or have a bunch of extracurriculars or have a bunch of other random factors that make them more likely to get into these sort of Ivy League schools. So that's the benefit. It's more meritocratic. We can imagine a very poor person who just is very smart and rises the ranks, gets access to the best educational policy. Best education. In the United States, if you're a poor person, you're not going to get the best education. Why? Because your school is funded based on property tax. And if you're poor, you're going to probably live in an area with other poor people. You're not going to have a lot of property tax in your area, so you're going to have a crappy school. So in our system, we tend to replicate inequality. Poor kids go to bad schools, and therefore they get bad outcomes. Now, it's not saying it's universal. There are plenty of very smart, poor kids who go to crappy schools and educate themselves. But that's the exception rather than the rule. For the most part, kids who go to crappy schools, get crappy educations, and have crappy outcomes. They wind up over across the street at Drew. However, in these meritocratic systems, that's not going to happen. Everyone starts with an education, and so we're going to be reducing the effect of luck and reducing the effect of class inequality. Now, the downside of that is that, well, it means you're going to be putting a lot of pressure on students. So, students who are able to afford tutors and can go to cram school for years on end in order to study the tests are going to do a little bit better on those tests. And to some extent, you are rewarding upper class students who can afford to pay for tutors. You're also putting students under a great deal of stress and a great deal of strain. And you can imagine being a fourth grader or a fifth grader or even an eighth grader and told your entire future depends on how well you do on this test. That's a lot of pressure you're putting on a little kid. In America, we reject that. We say that's not fair to those kids to put them under this sort of pressure. That no one's life should be set by how well you do on that test. But this also leads to higher suicide rates. This is what Ian just brought up about higher suicide and depression rates. Students who do poorly in these tests are going to have high suicide rates and high depression rates because you've just basically been told your life is over. Now, I think it's helpful, though, to think about this in other terms. That is, this is really about how do you ration educational resources. There's only so many good schools you can have. Now, you can spend more money, of course. You could put more tax dollars into schools and build more good schools. But assuming you're going to have a set amount of money for schools, how do you determine who gets access to the best schools and who gets access to the best resources? Well, in the United States, we have, I would argue, basically a nonsense system for doing that. We determine who gets the best schools and who gets the best resources and gets the best teachers based on what town you happen to live in. If you happen to live in a rich town, you get the best of everything. If you happen to live in a poor town, you get the worst of everything. And that's a nonsense way to do it. Now, I'm not saying the meritocratic system is a perfect way to do it, but at least you're dividing up resources basically saying, well, here's the smarter kids. We're giving the smarter kids more resources and the dumber kids less resources. That's cold-hearted. That's bad for those dumber kids because we can imagine maybe they're late bloomers. But in systems like that, late bloomers never get a chance to shine. So there's downsides to it. But if we think about it in terms of how we would want to divide up resources, assuming a limited amount of resources, it makes a lot more sense than the system we have now. I'm not saying it's the best way, but our current way of doing it certainly is nonsense. Okay, Amy's asking, when it comes to affirmative action, it said the quotas are illegal, so schools just use an unsaid quota. Oh boy. All right, so this is a really tough question on affirmative action. So let's talk quickly about the legality of affirmative action, because it certainly seems like affirmative action should be illegal. Affirmative action, at least on a racial basis. So affirmative action means we are treating people differently on the basis of the color of their skin, on the basis of the racial group. And that certainly seems unconstitutional. But it is perfectly legal for government to treat people differently, to discriminate on the basis of race, provided they can meet a strict scrutiny test. So when we're determining whether government action is constitutional or not, we have 3 levels of testing we use for this. The lowest level is called a reasonable basis test. A reasonable basis test basically asks, does the government have some good reason for doing this? It doesn't have to be a great reason, it doesn't have to be the best way to do this, but the government has to be able to articulate some reason for doing it. So for instance, when the government was asked to defend the ban on gay marriage and the Defense of Marriage Act of the Supreme Court said, all right, just give us the good reason why you're doing this. And the government couldn't come up with an acceptable good reason why they wanted to make sure homosexuals couldn't get married. Because the best reasons had to do with because Jesus said so, or because it'll cause heterosexual people to not get married anymore. And just they didn't have a good reason. They couldn't meet what we call a reasonable basis test. Above that is what we call a heightened scrutiny test. Heightened scrutiny means, all right, it doesn't have to be just something, it's just a good thing you want to do. It's not enough to articulate a reason. The government has to be articulate a reason and show that it's an important reason and that they're following it in a limited way. They're not going beyond what they need to do to fulfill that reason. That'd be heightened scrutiny. At the top of the chain, we get strict scrutiny. And for strict scrutiny, for the government to do something that requires a strict scrutiny test, the government has to prove that it is a vital government interest, something the government absolutely has to do. There's no other way to do it aside from what they're actually doing. And finally, they have to prove that this is the most limited way, that there's no way to do it that wouldn't harm some people. So if the government wants to discriminate on the basis of race, as in the case of affirmative action, so the affirmative action is, make no mistake, the government discriminates on the basis of race, they're going to have to show that it's a vital government interest at stake. All right, so vital government interest. What's the vital government interest there? The government argues, or universities essentially argue, that the government interest at stake is having a diverse class. So it is important for a university, in fact, vital for a university to have diversity in their class. You can't be a good school if you don't have some degree of diversity. I mean, if our university was entirely, white people from Scotch Plains, it wouldn't be a very good university. It would, again, be more like Drew. So we don't want that. So you have to have some degree of diversity. It's the government's allowed to discriminate based on race in order to create the diversity because that's considered to be a vital government interest. All right, the problem comes when we say, all right, how do we get that? Because under strict scrutiny test, we have to show that there's no more limited way in which we could pursue that interest other than what we're doing. So as a result, quotas have been ruled to be unconstitutional because because quotas are considered to be going too far. You don't need a quota to pursue affirmative action. You can do it without a quota, so there are more limited ways to do it, so therefore it fails a strict scrutiny test. Here's the problem. If you don't have a quota, how do you determine how many people of each group get in? Well, what essentially the Supreme Court said you're allowed to do is have a point-based system. So you have a point-based system. You can't have set-asides. You can't say, okay, our income class is going to be 8% African-American. You can't not do that. But what you're allowed to do is say, we're going to have a point system and give every African-American applicant some extra points in order to achieve a class that is about 8% African-American. And as long as you don't have a strict quota, that is considered to be perfectly constitutional. Now, that is hot nonsense on a platter. The Supreme Court actually said you're allowed that race can be a factor in the admissions decision, but cannot be the deciding factor in the admissions decision. That's nonsense. That literally makes no sense. So you say, oh, it can be extra points, but those points can't be the points that put you over the top? Question mark? How is that supposed to work? It doesn't make sense. But it's been interpreted as essentially meaning that the government, universities are allowed to use affirmative action, provided that they don't have a hard quota, provided that they have a floating quota and they use points to achieve the floating quota. It's thought to be just fine. Quotas are illegal, but points that amount to quotas are perfectly fine. The Supreme Court also has thrown out the idea in the 1990s that maybe we should be done with it. I mean, affirmative action, we've had affirmative action at that point for 30 years. Maybe we don't need it anymore. I think that's probably remarkably short-sighted. Essentially, it's tantamount to arguing there's no more races in America, and I think there probably is. But the Supreme Court has been showing willingness in the past to say, maybe we don't need affirmative action anymore, and we might get a resolution on that. We talked earlier in the semester about the race-based decision case involving Asian Americans, and Asian Americans are a group that is actually disadvantaged by affirmative action because if other groups get a benefit and Asian Americans don't, it reduces the number of Asian Americans who are actually in incoming classes. So if the University of California didn't have affirmative action, there'd be a lot more Asians in the University of California than there are now. Now, why are people so opposed to affirmative action? So it is relatively unpopular among white Americans. The big reason they're opposed to it is that they believe it means that qualified white applicants don't get seats. And there is a sense of victimhood among mostly white, heterosexual Christian men, saying that they are being disadvantaged because that's the group, white, heterosexual Christian men. They don't get any benefits from society. They don't get any affirmative action. Now, of course, we could point out that white, heterosexual Christian men basically run everything and own everything. So it's not clear they're being disadvantaged. They're being advantaged by society in general, just not in this one particular case. But I think it actually comes down to what we call the parking lot fallacy. So the parking lot fallacy, the handicap parking fallacy, essentially I'll say if you're driving around the mall now, it's around Christmas time, if you're driving around the mall and there's no parking spots, but you see, oh, there's a handicap spot open. You think, damn it. If they didn't have these set asides, they didn't let these handicapped people just come in and park in these spots, then I'd have a parking spot, right? This set aside directly disadvantages me because I would have a parking spot if they didn't have these handicap set asides. Now, it's a fallacy. It's a fallacy because, sure, it's true, there would be more parking spots available if there was no handicap parking spot, but that doesn't mean to be your parking spot. You're not the first person to be driving around this parking lot looking for a spot. If there were no handicap spots, somebody else would have gotten that spot before you probably. The odds that you'd be the one that benefit are incredibly low. So affirmative action does disadvantage a large group of people a little bit, but for the most part is doing it for people who are already advantaged in a number of other ways by society. All right, Ian's asking, is standardized tests we all took in school like the NJ Ask related to No Child Left Behind? All right, let's talk a little bit about No Child Left Behind. So No Child Left Behind, NCLB, this is an education reform law passed by President Bush, who famously asked, why is our children doing badly in school? So No Child Left Behind, the idea was to create some sort of accountability. There's been a bugbear among Republicans for a long time that there's no accountability in schools, that we don't know if our children are actually learning or not. Again, as Bush asked, is our children learning? So we don't know what's going on in actual classroom. Look, take this classroom you're in right now. I know you're not in a classroom, we're streaming. Let's just pretend. Nobody knows what I'm teaching you. I mean, they'd probably be very upset if they knew. I could be teaching you nothing of any use at all and giving you a good grade and then moving on with their lives. And as long as you guys weren't all a bunch of goddamn narcs, no one would ever know anything about it. Now, of course, we're not doing that, but there's a suspicion that you can't trust teachers, that teachers are going to take advantage of the system and aren't going to actually teach. And the evidence for this would come from the fact that students, when they get to college, don't seem terribly prepared for the workforce or for college. A lot of students wind up taking remedial courses. Remedial meaning this is stuff they were supposed to learn in high school and they didn't learn. So what's going on? Right? Who's supposed to be held accountable if our students are not learning? So the argument that's made is that schools are hamstrung. They have trouble teaching because teachers are unaccountable. Teachers are no one's monitoring what teachers are doing. And they're protected by unions. And most teachers in public schools are unionized. And it makes it hard, potentially, to get rid of bad teachers when bad teachers are in the system. So No Child Left Behind was an attempt to create some sort of accountability in the system. The way you do that is by having testing on a regular basis. So you test the students and to see if they actually learned anything or not. And the idea is that if schools are not teaching well or not teaching as well as other schools, then you can penalize them. And you would penalize them by taking away some of their federal money. So you penalize the schools, and this essentially allows a market to work. So schools that are doing a bad job, or even individual teachers doing a bad job, are penalized by the system. And as a result, there's going to be fewer of them. They're going to leave the profession, or those schools are going to shut down. Now, this was, of course, very controversial, partially just because teachers' unions didn't like it. But whenever we're trying to create accountability for teachers, we are also creating attention. So on the hand, we trust our teachers. We like our teachers. If you ask parents if they like and trust their students' teachers in the schools, they say, yeah, in general, we like and trust those teachers. They want the teachers to have autonomy, to be able to tailor class lessons to what works well in their class with students in their town and what's going on in those particular students. So we want to give teachers a lot of autonomy because we trust teachers. On the other hand, while I might trust teachers in general, or might trust my teachers, I don't necessarily trust teachers in general. I might think my teacher is great, but other teachers are doing a terrible job. So what do we do about that? So we want to do testing on other teachers, but not necessarily on our teacher. So while parents generally support testing as a way of finding out if the school's doing a good job or not, they don't support testing of their student. Whenever you include testing, you're essentially taking away autonomy from the teacher. Taking away autonomy because if you say testing, what you're doing is saying, teachers, you guys don't get to choose what you're going to teach. Rather, we as the outside force, we're going to tell you what's on the test. And therefore, we're going to tell you what it is you have to teach. And you have to teach the stuff we want you to teach in the way we want you to teach it so your students do well on the test. If they don't do well on the test, we're going to decide you're a bad teacher. Okay. So there's a necessary tension between teacher autonomy, trusting teachers, and testing in the classes. Now let's talk a little about how No Child Left Behind is actually supposed to work. The idea is that schools are supposed to show improvement, and the No Child Left Behind part of it is that schools are supposed to show that all groups are showing improvement. Now this actually winds up being very, very problematic because there are certain groups that's really hard to teach. So it's one thing to say, all right, look, you should have boys and girls both showing improvement. Great. You should also show improvement among people from different racial groups. Awesome. But what happens when you say you have to show improvement among kids with special needs? Those special needs kids don't do well on the tests. Should we penalize the whole school by saying, because we're saying your special needs students aren't doing well enough? Moreover, there's a big problem with showing improvement. What if your school is already really good? How do you show improvement if you're already doing really well? You run into what we call ceiling effects. Your students are doing really well. They're not going to do much better. So how do we deal with this? Well, in a lot of cases, schools come up with creative ways to deal with it. So, for instance, you do sign examples of schools where the schools are going to switch off different years. And so in year one, we're going to have all the students take the test together at the same time in a overcrowded, noisy gym. Why do we do that? So they do a bad job on the test. They get low scores. The next year, you're back teaching your nice, quiet classrooms, and now I showed improvement. It also leads to some teachers, you put a lot of incentive on this, and it leads to cheating. So there was a giant cheating ring happening in Atlanta where teachers were essentially erasing wrong answers and putting in correct answers in order to make sure the students did better because they had high-stakes tests and the schools depended on getting good scores, therefore creating incentive to have these sort of cheating rings. Now, under No Child Left Behind, if a school fails to show improvement, it can lose some of its money, but also it can lead to penalties for the entire school. And what can happen is the school can, federal money for the school can be sent instead to other schools in the area. And parents at that school are allowed to transfer their kids to other schools that are better performing, assuming those schools have seats. Now, this actually doesn't happen very often. Failing schools under No Child Left Behind are occasionally shut down, but mostly when they're shut down, they reopen again with just a new principal and maybe a new name the next year. So it doesn't actually change a whole lot under No Child Left Behind. Now, the controversy in recent years, rather than No Child Left Behind, was about standardized testing. The Obama administration tried to move away from No Child Left Behind and away from the sort of standardized testing, but they weren't able to actually pass a law to do it. So we're still basically stuck with the No Child Left Behind framework, where you have this, every state has to do this sort of testing every year. And the federal government came up with their own, the states themselves got together and came up with their own standards. The federal government tried to promulgate the standards put out by the states. And the problem is that we got a lot of pushback against them, that those standards were thought to be bad. They were linked to the federal government. We don't want the federal government telling us what to do. It's a fallacy, of course, because the states, in fact, were themselves putting together these standards, but it did lead to a lot of pushback. And we are moving, I think, away from having standardized testing. Now, this isn't to say that standardized testing is bad. One second, I have to turn the light on so we don't have the light in here. It's not to say that standardized testing is, in fact, a bad idea. I think under certain circumstances, standardized testing actually works very well, but you have to do it correctly. Teaching the test is only a bad idea if you've got a crappy test. If you've got a good test, then teaching the test doesn't seem like a problem at all. Now, if we're going to have standardized testing, the other way you can do it, you need to have the standardized test, the same test being given on a regular basis. And it's also important that you track individual students over time. Now, it would be unfair to penalize a teacher or penalize a school because they got a bad class. I mean, look, it's entirely possible, random sampling, right, that if you bring a bunch of kids into your school or into a particular class, you get a bunch of dummies one year. I mean, I know I've taught classes like that where suddenly, boy, these kids are not the smartest. So does that mean I'm a bad teacher because I got a bunch of dumb students one year? 2 years ago? Don't look it up. No, it doesn't mean that at all, of course. So what you have to do, if you want to do the testing right, is you actually have to track across time. So the idea is you track students every year and you track which class they're in. And what you do is you then say, all right, how much are students who are in Dr. Casino's class benefiting rather than students who are in someone else's class? And if you have enough years of data on the same teacher, you can see, am I doing better than other teachers or worse than other teachers? And because I'm doing within subjects, as I'm doing within individual students, I can see, am I improving the student more, the student do better with me, average student do better with me than does with another teacher. So it's possible, and it's a perfectly valid way to measure teacher success and to evaluate teachers. But a lot of teachers don't like it because, again, it does count against their autonomy. And teachers' unions, as you might expect, are pushed very forcefully back against it. Now, we're not going to see an end of testing altogether because there's a whole industry built around it. There's a lot of money involved, and also real estate agents like it. Testing allows real estate agents to say where the good schools are, and they want to be able to do that. All right, is asking, is there a country with a better education policy we should use as a model? Well, I'm not sure I'd want to go to a full meritocratic system. If we want to stick with a system similar to the one we have now, I would argue Finland has one of the best systems in the world. First off, they're raking those leaves all the time, so don't write that down. No, the big thing that they do is by spending a lot more money on education. Now, they can do that partially because they've got a much smaller population, like only about 8 million people in the country. But, for instance, all the teachers starting in kindergarten level all have master's degrees. And you're going to have two teachers in every class. And the teachers are given an enormous amount of autonomy because, well, they're highly educated people. They're paid very well. Median teacher salary somewhere around $120,000 equivalent a year. So pay teachers really well, and that attracts higher quality people in the profession. I think one of the biggest problems we have in the American system right now is that we don't pay our teachers very well. And so we don't get the best people in the schools being teachers because in order to be a teacher, you have to really love to be a teacher. It's a hard job. And we don't pay people very well. So if you pay people $30,000 a year, $35,000 a year as a starting salary, you're not necessarily going to get the best people in there. If you raise the salaries dramatically and also raise expectations, you probably get better people and you'd get better outcomes. It's not clear, however, that we're willing to actually invest that sort of money. So, yeah, are there other policies we could follow? Yeah. In terms of college admissions, I think the meritocratic system works well. But actually, I'm a big fan of also the way the Swiss run their college admissions program. The way the Swiss do it is that when you graduate from high school, nobody goes to college. Instead, you get government placement. You talk to your guidance counselor. You decide what you want to do, what sort of job you want to have. And your guidance counselor actually places you in a government-sponsored internship. So you're going to be working in oftentimes a factory, because in Switzerland they make all their own stuff, for a couple of years. And for 2 years, you work there in whatever sort of business or industry you want to work in. And after 2 years, during those 2 years, the government pays, I think, 3/4 of your salary, but you're still paid. The company pays you a quarter, the government pays 3/4 of your salary. And at the end of it, you decide, all right, do you want to keep on doing this? If you do, the company hires you, and now you've got a job. If you don't, you can choose to go to college and get a college degree. So most people, I think a majority still choose to go to college, but a lot of people say, no, I'm cool, I'm fine. So everyone's college. College at that point is basically paid for. It's free for people who do those 2 years of service beforehand. And you get a lot of people who just decide they're fine without it, and they've got good jobs regardless. This is why the unemployment rate is somewhere around 1.6% basically all the time. In terms of college, the other country I think does a very good job is actually Germany. So in Germany, when you go to college, you take your test, and then you get into college just generally. And basically, all the colleges, or the national government runs a system of colleges. They're all the best colleges, and you go to any of them. They have standardized curriculum, standardized majors, standardized requirements. You can transfer between anything, whatever the heck you want, and tuition is somewhere around 1,000 euros a year. And I remember last time I was there, I had people complaining that they had raised it to 1,000 euros a year because the government is subsidizing the heck out of all of it. So yeah, I think if we had more government control over the colleges and bigger subsidies for college students, and I think we could probably do a lot better with our college admissions policy. All right, Dan is also asking, would privatization schools and vouchers like DeVos wants help or harm U.S. students? All right, so privatization schools, we already have a private school system, as you all know, because you are currently attending a private university. And so there's no reason you can't have a private school system that coexists with a public school system. Something that happens in the United States, happens all over the world, it's fine. But if we have increased privatization, that actually tends to harm lower income students. The big reason it does that is that privatization requires you apply to schools and you get into them. And private schools have a tendency, reasonably so, to cherry pick the best students. I mean, if I'm a private school, I don't have to take everybody. I'm going to take the best students. Right? Why wouldn't I? And so that means the best students wind up in better schools, the private schools, and the worst students and poor students wind up in the public schools. The students nobody wants are in public schools. Now, what's the problem with that? Well, there's a couple of problems. First off, it means that we are now segregating on the basis oftentimes of race, but also just of class of the parents, education of the parents, the people who can afford the time and effort and know how to fill out the applications, get to better schools. And so you're replicating inequality. Moreover, if you put the bad students, the worst students, in worse schools, I mean, it's getting a little more meritocratic. And of course, it's also getting a little bit of racial segregation. But also, those schools wind up being worse. I mean, it's, again, a collective action problem, right? As the parents, I want my kid to go to the best possible school. I want my kid to be in a school with all of the smart kids. But if there's a school of just smart kids, that means there's also down the road a school of just dumb kids. So my selfish decision to put my kid in the best possible school disadvantages all the kids who would benefit if my kid was in their school, helping out the kids who are at the lower end of the spectrum. Now, I'm not comfortable telling any parent you shouldn't send your kid to the best school you can, but I'm not sure the government should be necessarily helping with that sort of cherry-picking process. Vouchers. The big problem we have with vouchers is that they do enhance this cherry-picking process because the private schools take the best kids and leave the public schools with the worst kids. But the other problem with vouchers is that vouchers are primarily used to help religious schools. So most private schools in the United States are religious schools, and I think there are important questions we have to ask before we're just okay with handing over lots of federal or state taxpayer money to private schools that are run by religious organizations for religious reasons. I mean, I'm not sure I'm happy with my taxpayer money going to pay for a Catholic school for other kids, or going to pay for rabbinical school, or going for any of that. I mean, I'm not sure that's a policy debate we could have, but I'm not sure it's necessarily the right way for us to be going. All right. Amy asks, is President Trump trying to appeal a bunch of ed policies via House Bill 610 and give the power to states? What benefits does this hold? All right. So the benefit is, of course, if you get the federal government out of the business of it, out of business education for the most part, and the way we do it nicely now is through what the federal government does is says, we're going to give you money, but you have to do all these other things if we give you money. So for instance, if you get federal government money for public schools, you have to teach sex ed in those schools. You don't teach sex ed? Hey, fine, your state, do whatever you want. Education's up to you, but you're not going to get federal government money. You have to have, similarly, you have to have equal athletic opportunities for men and for women. And the federal government says if you want our money, you have to do that. You have to offer free and subsidized school lunch. Okay, so these are all things that states have to do, and states are forced to do because the federal government ties the federal money to that. Well, what if the federal government got out of business entirely and said to states, do whatever you want. We're giving you this money as a block grant. You can do whatever you want with the money. There's no strings attached. Well, a lot of these things the federal government asks the states to do, the states would stop doing. Now, there's a perfectly reasonable people who say we should stop teaching sex education. They don't want sex education in schools. They think sex education should be left up to parents. Okay. But I think that I'm not sure I trust the states to do some sort of sex education. And we should know sex education, while there are people who are against it, is actually phenomenally popular, mostly among parents who do not want to talk to their kids about sex because that's super uncomfortable. So would it be good or bad? It depends on the state. It's my sense that New Jersey and Connecticut, the states that already spend a lot of money in schools. So New Jersey pays is the second highest funding on a per capita basis, per student basis in the country. Those states wouldn't change the policy very much at all. But Mississippi and Alabama, where they don't want to teach this stuff, they would change the policies quite a bit if no one was telling them what they had to do. So would it help or hurt? It wouldn't help you guys. It wouldn't help hurt anyone in the state we're in right now. But I think it could have potential effect, giving more autonomy to states that don't spend much money on education, and potentially leaving their students much worse off. All right. Heard that Betsy DeVos going after disabilities program. Is this true, or is my brain short-circuiting again? Yes. Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos has said that we're worried too much about disabilities and about allowing access for students with disabilities in the classroom. And look, there are times when you could argue that disabilities accommodation makes it difficult for schools to do their job. So disability accommodation. So if you've got students who are deaf, it turns out that it's very difficult to run. It's very difficult to run online classes for deaf students or for blind students because online classes are often rely on recorded lectures. And so if you've got a blind student, how are they supposed to do with recorded lectures? Or if information presented via video, then blind students can't do it. So yeah, and you can argue there's some cases where disability makes it harder. Disability also, accommodating disabilities also means that a lot of schools have to hire disability specialists. You might have to have one teacher per student for people who are severely disabled. And that's a relatively recent thing. That all goes back to the United States in the 1990s. Before then, they had basically separate schools for severely disabled children. So you could argue that that disability programs, disability accommodation, especially for children with severe disabilities, does cost schools a lot of money, and is a real financial drain on those schools and a resource drain on those schools. And so that's why Secretary DeVos has been going after them. Now, I'm not sure what your alternative is to that, though. If you say, okay, we're not going to accommodate disabilities, well, what do you do then? You just say severely disabled children don't go to school? I mean, that was the solution for most of American history. But I hope we're not going back to a place where we say, well, we're not going to bother trying to teach disabled children because it's not worthwhile. Because, look, the one disabled person we all learn about in school is Helen Keller, who was severely disabled, deaf and blind, and also then went to Harvard and wrote books. So, just saying we're not going to educate disabled people seems like a pretty terrible idea. George asks, what about the schools with low scores? How can they show improvement to lose funding? The answer is they can't. Yeah, that's kind of the trap. If you are a low-performing school, and your students start to leave, so if you're a low-performing school and you have low scores over a long amount of time, parents are given funding and their parents are allowed to leave. Which parents leave? Well, the parents who are the most able students, they get out. And then your school's worse. So you do worse in the test the next year. What happens, you're in this downward spiral. And essentially, you wind up having to fire. What those schools wind up doing, basically, is to try and get out of it. They wind up firing a bunch of people, fire the principal, fire a bunch of teachers, bring in new people, and hope that that helps, or at least that they can show we're doing something about it, and therefore they don't lose their money. So how can they show improvement? They can't. They get stuck in that trap. And this is, again, what leads to some of these things like the cheating rings in Atlanta schools, whereas the schools are not doing well, so they're going to cheat to try and show improvement, even if there isn't really any improvement. All right, I want to move on and talk a little about the Moynihan Report. Oh, it's almost 4 o'clock, so we're doing pretty well. I want to talk a little about the Moynihan Report. This is from the Ta-Nehisi Coates book. I want you guys, again, to give me some comments over there, questions you had about the Moynihan Report. I think it's a very interesting document, right? So the Moynihan Report, this is Daniel Patrick Moynihan, senator from New York, making an argument about the state of the African-American family, and basically saying the African-American family at the time was in crisis. Now, what was his big problem? The reason he thought the African-American family was in crisis was because of the high rates of children that are born out of wedlock. And at that point, it's about 40% of children born out of wedlock. And he said, look, this is a real problem. Because what are we supposed to do? So if we have this sort of traditional family structure, traditional family structure relies on a man who's the provider and a woman who raises the children, and then a bunch of children. Well, what do we do when that family structure breaks down? When you don't have men raising children, when we got children born outside of wedlock? And he predicted all sorts of really terrible outcomes from that if we didn't do something about this problem. He also argued that, made arguments about, well, what's causing this? Why do we have these high levels of children being born out of wedlock? Now, the reason I want to talk about this is partially because, look, a lot of it is very paternalistic, very sexist. I mean, the assumption made in the Moynihan Report is that women cannot be heads of household, and that's kind of plainly not true. Of course they can be, and we know that now. And it's also mirroring a problem we have just in general. In America today, we've got large portions of children. I think the modal group of children is born outside of wedlock, right? People are getting married less. And so all these problems that Moynihan is talking about as being a problem for African-American families are now a problem for families in general in the United States. So the Moynihan Report, I think, is interesting in that it is, in one hand, it's very much a product of its time, right? It is sexist. It is paternalistic. It is, I think, trying not to be racist, but I think probably still a little racist, maybe a lot racist. On the other hand, it is, I would say, very compassionate. It's not saying, as many documents about the same time might, it's not saying that, look, this is a problem because African Americans are just terrible. It's not saying that. Rather, it's saying this is a problem of society. We need to do something about this. So what is it that so first off, do we still think it's a problem that we have so many children born outside of wedlock? We have children born to single mothers. We have parents who are, fathers who are absent. or co-parenting without being married to the mother? Do we think that's a problem? Are we worried about that? Or maybe that's just a sexist relic. So again, comments over in the chat box. So that's one side of it. Do we think this is still a problem? On the other hand, if we don't think this is a problem, isn't it better for children if children are raised in a two-parent household? And what are the ramifications for our society if we move to a society where two-parent households are no longer the norm? So he's asking, why should focus on family structure for African Americans in particular above other groups or minorities? Well, at the time, it was because they were trying to address, oh boy, these terms are so racist. They're trying to address the problems of the ghetto. Like, what are the problems in African American culture? They said, look, this trend happened first among African Americans. It was among African Americans first that you did have higher rates of children being born outside of wedlock. Now, why we're worried about that? Because that was linked to crime, it was linked to social disorder. So the implicit argument, in some cases the explicit argument, that the Moynihan report was making is that the rates of crime, the rates of social disorder among African Americans were a result of this breakdown in the family structure. So if the family structure breaks down, society is going to break down too. In society, if the family structure is paternalistic and sexist, guess what? Society at the time, and to some extent today, is still paternalistic and sexist. So if the family breaks down, society itself is going to break down as well. And that's what Moynihan is worried about. So he's saying, look, he believes he's seeing, in this 1960s, we're seeing the consequences of the societal breakdown. Rioting, increased crime rates. This is all the consequence, he argues, of the breakdown of the family. Now, is the government supposed to be concerning itself with the breakdown of the family? If you've got birth rates outside wedlock, is that something the government needs to prevent? So the government be encouraging people to get married? That doesn't seem like sort of thing we want the government to doing. But if we think that the breakdown of the family structure does lead to breakdown in society, it makes sense you might want to do something to try and fix that problem. Moreover, as said, the rates of being born outside of wedlock are up now across the board. So if we think seriously, that break down the family structure and change the family structure, change the way society works, it makes sense that we would be worried about that on the basis for the entire society right now, because white children are dominantly born outside of wedlock now. Now, in order to put this in context, we should talk about why is it that we have increasing numbers of children born outside of wedlock now. A couple reasons. Number one, the rate of first marriage is getting older and older. That is, young people are waiting longer and longer to get married. And so the average age of first marriage in America among men is 27 now, and among women is 25. And that's up dramatically. If we had gone back 30 or 40 years, women on average were getting married when they're 22 or 23. Men were getting married when they were just about 2 years older than that. So people are getting married older and older and older. However, having children is somewhat of a biological issue. After a certain age, physicians generally say about the age of 32, it becomes much, much harder to bear children. So if you're not getting married until you're older and your fertility is still an issue, you're going to wind up having children earlier. So even if people are having children or getting married later, they're not necessarily waiting longer to have sex, although actually they kind of are today. We'll talk about that later, I guess. So you've got more children being born. Also, there's a change in what marriage means. So marriage before was seen as a step into adulthood. That is, in order to be a properly adult member of society, you had to do things like graduate from school, get a job, buy a house, get married. And so marriage was kind of one of those steps in what you're supposed to do to become an adult. Today, I think the meaning of marriage has changed. It's perfectly reasonable to say, hey, we're adults, we're just not married. And that's more socially acceptable. Moreover, marriage is now seen almost as a goal rather than as a step to reach that sort of goal as being a socially accepted adult. So when we interview people and ask them about what the meaning of marriage is today, they'll tell us that marriage means you have achieved stability. And so therefore they're waiting until they achieve stability, often financial stability, before they get married. Now, that's perfectly reasonable. But it does mean that people are waiting longer to get married, especially poor people, because if you're waiting until you have financial stability and you're poor, that may never actually come, which is another one of the reasons why more children are born outside of wedlock. We also, if we take a look at children born outside of wedlock, we also see that this is a highly classed phenomenon. That is, among poor people, many, many children born outside of wedlock. Among wealthy people, it's not very likely at all. So wealthy people don't have children born outside of wedlock, where poor people do. Why is that? Well, part of it's education, part of it's money. Remember, marriage is now seen as something you do once you get some money. Then you get married. Well, so rich people, this isn't a problem for them, or even middle class people or college graduates, not a problem. But among women who don't have a college education, who have only high school education, getting some money and getting married winds up being a pretty significant problem. As they can't afford to get married, and they can't necessarily afford, so therefore you have more children being born outside of wedlock. Now, is this a social problem that we need to be worried about? Well, I think you can certainly argue that the family structure we had when Moynihan's report comes out might be desirable in some cases. The big reason it might be desirable in modern American society is because of childcare. Childcare is insanely expensive in the United States. This is something that we do very poorly as a country. So again, give me your comments. How much do you think childcare actually costs? Right? What is the mean cost of childcare in the United States on a per child basis? So per child per month. So what do you think it's going to cost? So if you decide to have a child, put it in the chat window. Tell me exactly how much money you think people are spending on average to pay for their childcare. Now, I would argue if childcare is cheap, then changing family structure is not necessarily a problem. It's not a problem because you can go ahead and if childcare is cheap, then you can still hold a job and do whatever else you need to do while having childcare. So Ian's is $20,000 a year per child. Okay, let's get some more guesses in there. So if childcare is cheap, we don't necessarily have a problem. We should note in most countries in the world, childcare is relatively cheap. And the reason it's cheap is subsidized by the national government. Why does the national government subsidize it? In order to keep people in the workforce. We want people working. And if you want women to work, we have to find something to do with children. So it could be you give fathers time off to take care of the children. This would be a Norwegian model. Dan's asking, I'm saying childcare as in daycare, right? Drop the kid off at 9, pick him up at 5 so you can go to work. So if the government subsidizes it, that keeps people in the workforce. If the government doesn't subsidize it and childcare is expensive, then people drop out of the workforce in order to take care of their children. And that is a real drag on the economy. And it's a problem. Let's see. Peter's saying probably $1,000 a month. Ian's saying plus you have things like preschool. Preschool, we should note an increasing number of areas preschool is actually provided by the state. George is saying about $15,000 a year. You guys are actually pretty close. Peter's directly on there. Ian's saying about $10,000 a year. The median cost in the United States for childcare is $1,000 a month. So about $12,000 a year. Amy saying $20,000 went to really good childcare. Your parents loved you. About $12,000 a year. About $1,000 a month. Zane's asking, doesn't it cost about $200,000 to raise a child until they're 18? It depends how much they eat. It depends highly on how much money you have to start with. So that'd be among upper middle class people, $200,000 sounds about right. Poor people do it much cheaper because they don't have that much money. All right, so childcare in the United States is very expensive, $1,000 per child per month. So if you've got 2 children, that would mean you're spending $24,000 a year. That might be if you're an average working American, that is more than half your salary goes straight to childcare, and that's dumb because it means there's going to be a lot of people who are going to say, "I'm just going to stop working in order to take care of my children." Now, that's perfectly reasonable. My mother didn't work when I was a child. That's fine. I came out okay, I guess. We're not all sociopaths. But it does mean that the economy is worse off because people are dropping out of the workforce when they could, if you had government subsidized childcare, stay in the workforce and continue to contribute to society. Now, a lot of women in the United States come to the conclusion that the right thing to do, therefore, is to drop out of the workforce, take care of the children, and then, when the children go to school, to re-enter the workforce. And that's a great idea, but we should know in the United States it doesn't actually work in practice because it means you're out of the workforce for a minimum of 5 years, and women report that it's incredibly difficult to get jobs after being out of the workforce for that long. All right, so our society is fundamentally changing, and that marriage is less central to our society than it was before. People are getting married later. People are having children outside of wedlock. It's not considered to be something necessary to be an adult. So is that good, bad, and different? Well, it has changed the way our society works. And I'm not sure society has the social structures have necessarily caught up with that. That is, there is now more people who just aren't married and aren't going to get married or aren't going to have children. And that does lead to some societal problems. So it does mean for elderly people who don't have children. In the past, you were taking care, when you're elderly, you're taking care of by your children. What do you do with increasing number of people who don't have children? We're not sure. We haven't figured out a way around it. So the Moynihan Report, I think, is kind of broadly applicable. And I think what I like about it is it does take seriously what are we supposed to do about these problems. If we believe that it is better when we've got two parents for children, and I think in general it is, if parents are involved in a good relationship, it probably is better for children to have two parents in a household. So should the government be in the business of forcing that or of encouraging that? So if we wanted to encourage it, it wouldn't necessarily be that hard. If the government wants to encourage something, we do this all the time. We just give a tax break. We decrease taxes for people who are married and living together. We actually do this already. It's called the marriage. We got rid of what's called the marriage penalty in the tax system. So if you are a married couple filing jointly, and one of you makes much more money than the other, you'll pay a lower tax rate if you're married than if you're unmarried. Now, if you're a married couple and if you're a married couple and both of you make about the same amount of money, you'll actually wind up paying more in taxes than you would if you were not married. So we do have a marriage penalty essentially designed to encourage people to get married if they've got relatively unequal incomes. Does it work? I mean, I don't know. I can't imagine anyone saying, boy, I don't want to get married, but I'll save $3,000 a year on my taxes, so I guess I will. So I'm not sure the government's doing a very good job of encouraging that. But the question, I think it's interesting to ask in the Moynihan Report, should we be encouraging this sort of thing? Is this even the sort of thing the government should be in the business of? Ian Havern saying with hand-me-downs won't be cheaper to a second child. The answer is yes and no. Parents, the second child, the hand-me-downs don't save a lot of money, and you wind up having to buy more stuff, and you need a bigger house because you've got two children. Ian Cummings asked, I've heard this type of dynamic can lead to problems that we had Social Security in general, not enough tax income, social to fear. So the nice thing about taxes, if you ever don't have enough tax revenue, you can always just raise taxes. But yes, it does reduce societal, the fact that we have parents staying home to take care of children does reduce our size of our workforce. If you look at other countries, I'm thinking here of South Korea, they've got a big problem where they're trying to get women to work. This is a big deal because women in South Korea and to a certain extent Japan just drop out of the workforce and get married. And like, boy, if we could get women to work, we could double the size of our workforce, double the size of our economy. So we need to get women to work in order to increase our economic productivity. So in America, we're kind of going the opposite way from that. Dan is saying, I think another factor is couples deciding to get married or not is the biological clock, and there's more is conceived now like IVF or sperm donors. It's absolutely true. There are more ways for people to reproduce aside from the old-fashioned way. The biological clock is a big factor in people getting married. I would actually argue it's probably a bigger factor in when they decide to have children. But while there are other things you can do, like IVF, that is a option that is open mostly to upper middle class or wealthy people. New Jersey is kind of unique in that New Jersey's, I think, one of two states in the country where health insurance covers IVF. Most states in the country, it doesn't cover it. Meaning that if you want to have if you want to use IVF to have a child because you have fertility problems, you are looking at $20,000 or $30,000 in cash in order to do that. And most families just do not have access to that kind of money. They don't have that sort of savings. They can't afford to spend that money. And that's assuming it works the first time. So there are more ways for people to have children. People can have children outside of wedlock. And I think that may be one reason why there's less pressure, especially on women, to get married, because you can have children even if you never get married. So there's less pressure on them. But again, there's less pressure, I'd argue, on upper class women, wealthier women, and more educated women, rather than less well-educated women. Ian comes in. Young folks see how hard it is to pay for a kid and have kids later, reducing the total number of kids which are had and make the overall population older. It's 100% true. Absolutely true in the United States that we have a lower fertility rate. So we talk about fertility rates. We're normally talking about a statistic called TFR, that is total fertility rate. And that is simply the average number of children that a woman has during her lifetime. Now, replacement level, that is, you want to maintain a population exact same size you have now, replacement level is 2.1 TFR, meaning you have two children and a little bit extra because some kids die or they don't have children or whatever. So 2.1 is considered replacement level. And among white Americans, we are now below replacement level. White Americans are now somewhere around 1.9 or 2. And the United States as a whole is only above replacement level because mostly Hispanics are having a lot more children, therefore raising our average. I think the average total fertility rate in the United States is right around 2.3, largely because immigrant groups, especially Hispanics, have more children. In other countries where they don't have as much immigration, this is a much bigger problem. So again, let's go back to Japan real quick. Japan has the lowest fertility rate in the world. They're hovering somewhere around 1.3 or 1.4. So average Japanese woman has 1.3 or 1.4 children. Why is that a problem? That means that if you have one child, 1.3, your population is declining on about 30% every generation. And that's a huge problem because you won't be able to do as much. Your society won't be able to do as much because you simply have fewer people in it. Now, the solution in general to problems of fertility rate, and it's not just Japan, Western Europe in general has a problem with fertility rates, where women are getting started having babies older, which isn't a bad thing because you've got more money, you've got more intelligence, you know what you're doing better, but it means you have fewer children. So if you start having children when you're 30 years old rather than 20 years old, you just don't have as much time to have as much children. You wouldn't necessarily want to have as many children. You wouldn't want to have as many children, and you wouldn't necessarily have time if you did want to have as many children as you might otherwise. So in Italy, for instance, Italy and in the Netherlands and in France, they have a real problem where they just don't have women. Women are starting later. And again, if you allow for immigration, you can solve the problem. But if you're a country like Italy that doesn't want immigration, or Japan that really, really, really doesn't want immigration, you don't have that option open to you. And so you have to find other ways to try and encourage people to have children. And if that fails, you have to find something to do to replace all that. So Japan, they're trying to fix it with robots, right? Rather than import some Vietnamese people to have more babies, they instead just say, you know what, we're going to build a bunch of robots, and that'll try and solve the problem with that. Now, so if your total fertility rate is falling, got a problem. Now, why is the total fertility rate falling? The United States and Japan and Italy and other countries around the world, why is it falling? Most of it has to do with education for women. So it turns out as women get more educated, they're less interested in sitting at home and making babies and taking care of babies, as you might reasonably expect. So because they're less interested in doing that, they start later. They start having babies later and have fewer babies in general. So it's gender equality, more education for women that leads people to have a lower fertility rate. However, doesn't seem to be quite that simple because there are societies that have relatively high education for women that don't seem to be having that problem. And the issue actually seems to be what we call an interaction effect between the level of education for women and how patriarchal the society is. So Japan, for instance, is having a much bigger problem than other countries because that's a very patriarchal society that tends to be biased against women. And so women don't want to get, and same in Italy, that the women don't want to get married because the men are sexist. They don't want to be part of this. And so they're opting out and waiting more and more. In countries where women are educated, but society is relatively less sexist, you don't have this problem. So Sweden doesn't seem to have a problem with fertility rates, despite a very educated female population, because society is generally pretty egalitarian. So George just deleted a message, but he was asking how Japan is doing it. What do you mean by Japan? So what I'm talking about here is actually healthcare robots. Get everybody out of the gutter. So what are the political ramifications of this? Well, part of it is that you get a lot of men who aren't getting married and aren't having children. And this is a real problem because when men don't get married, they get restless. Men don't have access to sex, don't have access to families till later. Men do stupid shit, and they generally tend to stop doing stupid shit when they get married. So the longer way for men to get married, the more stupid shit they do. You can actually discern this in the data about criminal behavior and about drunkenness and about accidents. So basically, older men who aren't married have much higher rates of criminal behavior, much higher rates of drinking, and much higher rates of getting into accidents of any type than men who are married. So essentially, marriage is good for no other reason than it stops men from doing all the stupid shit they otherwise would generally do. Okay, you know what, guys? It is 4:20 almost, so it's time to go smoke up. It is time for me to head out. I want to thank you all for this. I know this was this is suboptimal, but we should be back in our regular time next week. Thank you very much. I'll keep the live stream open for a couple minutes in case you have any time. But if you're all done, look out. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next week. Thanks. I am doing my best. I'm feeling way better. I was a real wreck a couple weeks ago. Thank you. Thank you, Neil. I guess I'm very jealous of, I think, the Twitter Live. When they do Twitter Live, they get little hearts on the side of the screen. I don't get that. It's all right. What's really weird is the number of people who watch these things that aren't in this class. I'm like, what are you doing? Why would you watch this? I mean, if you're watching, you're not in my class, that's fine. But, still, seriously. All right. Thank you very much. Shutting off the live stream now.